I was spending a couple weeks in Montana last year. I had a camper I was living out of set up on the back of my truck, so I was usually parking on campgrounds or wherever there was public land. This was one of my last days, so I had to start heading back from the direction I came. Unfortunately, I had a bit of trouble with my truck that day, and it took most of the day to fix. So by the time the sun was setting, I'd barely made any progress on my drive. I got a coffee from a gas station and decided to go at least for 2 more hours, then find somewhere to camp out the night. Over the next little bit that I was driving, the road cleared up and was pretty much all to myself. I used an app to find the nearest place I could camp at, and I found a spot that was just off the road on public land. When I got to the turn, it was a thin dirt path that went about a 1/4 mile into the woods. At the end was a small grass circle surrounded by the woods and nothing else. It was vacant of any other campers. I parked on the end of the circle, facing the exit, then walked around to the camper and got in. I think it was probably 11 or 12 by then, and I was just about ready to fall asleep as soon as I laid down. Only a minute or so later, though, a beam of light shined through the edges of the privacy screen that I had on my windows. I sat up and lifted the corner just enough so I could see out the window. Someone else's headlights were coming down the path. As they got closer and up to the end of the path, they slowed to a stop. It looked like they saw me and maybe didn't want to camp at the same spot, but instead of turning around, they just stayed there on the end of the path. I could see that it was a truck, pretty old looking, with rust all over their front bumper, but the headlights were too bright to see much of anything else. Since they were still on the path, too, their truck was facing directly at me and blocking the whole way out. Something about this felt off. It was just a gut feeling, I guess. But after a few minutes of them sitting there, I knew I wasn't going to be able to sleep here. I folded up my bed and got up. Before I could leave the camper and get into my truck, though, one of their doors opened. I looked back out the window. They had turned their headlights off, and 2 men were standing outside in the dark. They began walking toward my camper, and I could only see the outline of something in their hands. I covered the window again and listened to their footsteps approaching. They were trying to be quiet, carefully walking around my truck until they both suddenly stopped. It was like they suddenly knew somehow that I was awake. "Hey, can you help us? We're just in need of some directions. Can you open up?" I was terrified now, and from their voice, I think they were drunk or something, so I had no idea what they were capable of. I snuck a look out one of the windows and could see one of them right up against my truck, holding a type of crowbar, sledgehammer, or something similar. That confirmed their bad intentions, but I still had no way to leave without getting out of my camper and into my truck. One of them walked up to the door, scraping something against it and pressing into it, definitely trying to pop it open. I don't know why I was still trying to be quiet, as if they didn't know I was inside, but I put my legs against the door, trying to hold it in place. Then, completely out of nowhere, there was a gunshot. Not from the men, though. It was from farther out in the woods that were surrounding the area. Both men stopped for a moment, then sprinted back to their truck. Within 30 seconds, they were gone. I still had no idea what that was, but I knew if I was going to leave, now was my best chance. I fled from the camper and straight into the truck. I did a quick glance around as I started it up, but didn't see anyone in the woods that had fired their gun. I drove down the path and onto the main road, stopping an hour later at a relatively busy truck stop. What really happened back there is up for debate. Honestly, I think that by some miracle, a hunter or someone camping had been close by and saw what was happening, so they fired a warning shot to save me. Considering how remote I was though, it's just so unlikely that I can't say for sure, but it's really the only thing I can think of. If not for it though, my truck and camper would probably be anonymously listed on Craigslist right now, and I probably never would have been seen again. I was in Washington State, spending several days backpacking through the national parks. I was already about 20 miles out from the nearest road, and for the first 2 days, I hadn't run into a single person. It was the beginning of fall, so the weather was a bit colder than most people would be okay with, but I had all the necessary equipment. Anyway, in the morning, I got up and made a quick coffee over my pocket stove, then headed out to the next campsite. It was 6 miles out, which in the mountains is a pretty far hike. 4 hours into this walk though, I suddenly heard footsteps ahead of me. I looked up and saw a man walking along the trail, going the opposite way as me. I wasn't really expecting to see anyone, but I smiled and nodded as he passed by. But I noticed something really strange. He had no backpack, no water bottle, literally nothing. He was just wearing a long-sleeve t-shirt and some old hiking pants. I even turned around to get another look at him because I was so confused. When I did though, he happened to also glance back at me, so to keep things from being weird, I just turned back around and continued walking. After getting some distance, I kind of forgot about it. I think I came up with some idea that he had a campsite nearby and was just going for a walk, but I also knew that no established camps were anywhere near there. Whatever the case, I didn't find it worth thinking on too much. The next several hours were difficult, but eventually I made it to my campsite. It was empty, with just one small spot for my tent to go on. It wasn't as great as I was hoping though. The view was supposed to be a lot better, but from the actual campsite, there wasn't really any view at all. It was kind of covered up by all the trees. The whole campsite really just felt like it was in the middle of a forest, rather than on a mountaintop. I was rightfully exhausted though, and went straight away to setting up my tent, and then relaxing while watching the sunset. As I sat there, I randomly heard a shuffling sound behind me. I turned and was completely stunned to see that same man I'd run into earlier. He still had no backpack or anything, but even more confusing was why he was at this campsite. He was walking in the complete opposite direction when I last saw him, and for him to get here now, he must have turned around pretty soon after running into me. As he walked up to the campsite, he didn't look at me, like he was purposefully pretending that I wasn't there, or that he couldn't see me. He went up to the other side of this small area we were in, and he sat down. No tent, no sleeping bag, no anything. Just sitting on the dirt and looking out into the forest. He was only 15 or so feet from me, but with him looking away, I was able to get a much better look at him. The man looked like he was in his late 30s and had a short scruffy beard with short brown hair. I couldn't help but feel really uneasy. Nothing about this was natural, and as the sun continued to set, it only made me feel even more unsafe. Who was this guy, and what the hell was he doing 25 miles out in the forest with no shelter or food or water? About 30 minutes passed, and he still didn't move. I decided though that I couldn't stay there. I had nowhere else to really go, but I figured I just had to find some random spot and make sure he didn't follow me. I began taking down my tent and packing up, and it was only then that the man looked over at me, and once he did, he never looked away. Every time I looked at him, he was staring right at me. Once I got everything stashed in my backpack, I saw in the corner of my eye that the man stood up. I began walking as fast as I could, hearing his footsteps following close behind me. I clutched my small knife tightly in my hands, unsure what was going to happen. After a minute, I looked back a few times, seeing him still following, but getting further away. Then I took a risk. I veered off the trail and into the woods. It was pitch black by now, so I hoped he didn't see me and would just keep walking. Once I was maybe 20 feet into the woods, I leaned out behind a tree and waited. 30 seconds later, his footsteps came down the trail, but just as he was about to pass by, he stopped. I watched his figure in the dark, looking around as if he knew I wasn't on the trail anymore. Then he started yelling. He was trying to sound friendly, too, which made it even more disturbing. After 2 minutes, though, he stopped yelling, but instead of going back to the campsite, he walked straight into the woods on the other side of the trail. His figure disappeared, and the woods fell silent. I must have waited there for over an hour before finally getting up and making my way back. I forced my body to push through and skip the next campsite just to be safe. When I was back in town, I put in a report with the local police office. They never followed up with me though. I don't know if that man was living out there, or was trying to rob or kidnap people, or maybe even both, but I'm lucky to have gotten away when I did. I work at a gas station. I'd been there for several years, and this night was one that I assumed would be like all the rest. I came in at 8 and took over for the day worker, who went home right away. The first couple hours went by quickly, as there were still customers coming in regularly to buy a few things or to pay for gas with cash. Between 11 and 12, it slowed down to where it began feeling like the shift was dragging on. I kept myself busy for another hour, or at least tried to, with stocking whatever I could find, but then I was left with the dreaded second half of my shift. It was always slow, boring, and just not enjoyable. Around 1 though, a car pulled in and parked in the spaces by the entrance door. A few other cars had come through recently, but just to get gas real quick. Very rarely would someone actually park in the spots and come into the store this late into the night. I stood up straight and tried to rub the tired look off my face, expecting them to come in. A couple minutes went by though, and they didn't. I leaned over the counter and looked out the glass door, but couldn't really see anything. The reflections on the door were blocking any way for me to see inside their car. Maybe they were just taking a break from a long drive. I didn't bother caring too much about it. I sat back and pulled up my phone. I spaced out, reading through random articles and whatnot for probably 20 or so minutes. During that time, I never heard anything or saw anything, but eventually I looked up from my phone and my heart almost stopped. There was a guy inside the store, standing in one of the aisles and looking right at me. His eyes darted away as soon as I saw him. This guy looked like he was mid-40, with a dark jacket on and a scruffy beard. I never saw or heard him enter, so how the hell did he get in? While my mind was racing, I just watched as the man kept walking around, glancing over at me a few times to see if I was looking, like he was planning to do something as soon as I looked away. Then, after just 30 seconds, he suddenly hurried toward the front door and ran outside. I got up and ran to look out. This was when I noticed the car was still there, but the guy walked right past it and just out to the road until I could no longer see him. I immediately went to the cameras to see how he got in and figure out what was going on. It only took me a minute to find the footage of him slowly and quietly getting out of the car, then going to the back of the gas station. There were no cameras back there, but those doors were never locked since the gas station was technically always open anyway. What's really odd is that there were 15 minutes between the time he went around to the back to the time he walked out onto the sales floor. Police came to help me investigate, ultimately finding the car he left to have been a stolen vehicle from months ago. They didn't know anything about the guy or his motives. Sneaking around though, he clearly had something else intended for that night, and I think I was really lucky that for one reason or another, he decided not to go through with it. This was just over 2 years ago. My name is Jake, and before this I had no camping experience whatsoever. I really wanted to get into it though, and the only way to get into it is to go out and do it. So this was my first camping trip. I chose a campground 2 hours away from my city. It was one that seemed like it wouldn't be too crowded, but also I wouldn't be completely alone, which I thought would be ideal for my first time. I drove up there and arrived at the trailhead around noon, then hiked for another few hours before getting to the campground. There were a few park-style benches and a couple ground-mounted barbecue grills around the site. A few short trails split off and went to smaller campsites, where some other people had tents set up. I went down one of these trails and put my things down, then spent the next hour getting my tent set up correctly and making sure everything was working properly. By then, a few people were in the middle area, using the grills and chatting. I'm not a super social guy, so I didn't feel comfortable inserting myself into the group, but a half hour later, a guy walked down to where I was set up and invited me to hang with them. It was a nice gesture, and he seemed cool enough, so I went with it. I followed him up and met a few of the others that were camping here. Everyone was cool, so I hung around for another hour, but after that some people split ways. I said goodnight to everyone and headed back to my tent as well. It was probably around 7, so just an hour left of sunlight, when TJ, the guy from earlier, came walking back to my tent. For reference, he was around my age, like mid to late 20s. When he came over, he asked if I'd ever been to this area before. I said no, and then he asked if I knew about the lake that was nearby. I said no again, and he immediately started telling me about this amazing hidden lake that nobody knew about and how it was a super cool spot and that he was going to head there if I wanted to tag along. Again, it seemed like a friendly gesture, and honestly, I was super intrigued. I tossed my stuff back into my tent and left everything there, then followed him. He said it was a 10-ish minute walk through the woods, so we definitely had enough time before sunset. From the campsite, we followed this really thin footpath through the trees. It wasn't a defined trail at all, but it looked like it had at least been used a few times before. 10 minutes passed though, and there was no lake in sight. TJ also got weirdly quiet. Before he was very talkative and charismatic, and now he was suddenly giving one-word responses. He also kept looking out at the sunset, and while he could have just been trying to make sure we had time, something in me felt like he was doing the opposite. Like he was waiting for the sun to go down. After 20 minutes of walking, I started putting some distance between us. I wasn't so sure anymore about what this was, but I could feel my adrenaline kicking in, so I guess my body knew. The sun was just barely lighting up thin rows of light through the trees, and it felt like the forest was so quiet all of a sudden. When I thought I had a chance, I turned and tried to quietly run back the way we came, but he immediately noticed. He called out once in a nicer tone, as if still in character as my friend, but then he quickly turned to frustrated yelling as I could hear him sprinting behind me. There was probably an entire minute of him yelling and chasing me through the woods before I could hear his steps slowing down. Then I heard a loud metallic thump right behind me. I looked back for a split second, seeing what looked like a knife ricocheting off a tree a few feet from me. I guess it was his last-ditch effort to stop me. After that, I lost him. I got back to the others and tried to tell them what happened, and one of them called the police for me. TJ, or whoever he was, never came back. In fact, everyone said he was already at the campsite when they got there, and after a bit of looking, he didn't even have a tent anywhere. He probably targeted me though, because I was alone, and he knew I hadn't had much hiking or camping experience. Thankfully, I didn't have to find out what he had intended for that night though, because if I had, I probably wouldn't be here. I was camping in Utah for a small weekend getaway. It really was nothing special. I'd hiked up to a small lake and was only going to stay overnight. When I got there, it was more crowded than I was hoping for. I mean, there were 2 groups near the beach, so it wasn't flooding with people or anything, but it definitely wasn't quiet either. Around 5 though, both groups started packing up, and within the hour they left the area. With only an hour left of sunlight, and having the beach to myself, I quickly changed into my swimsuit and jumped into the lake. I was only in there for like 10 minutes, not too long at all, when I looked back at the campsite. The woods were calm and the sun was setting over the trees, but past the beach and a little ways into the forest, a person was watching me. They were too far for me to see much, but it was definitely a man, and they were definitely looking at me. As soon as I caught them looking, they turned their head and walked further into the trees. It was too creepy for me not to get a little shaken up. Was it just a guy from one of the groups that maybe forgot something? Or maybe a hiker that I happened to catch looking over at an awkward time? The way they were just stopped and standing there, looking directly at me, was still super unnerving. I walked back up the beach and over to my tent. I dried off and kept my head on a swivel, scanning the forest for that man. I cooked up a small meal and continued to look around for him. A whole hour passed, and there were no sightings, so I figured I was good. I stayed up fairly late, at least a couple hours after sunset, mostly looking up at the stars and resting. It sounds boring to just sit there, but it's actually really nice. After a while, I got in my tent and laid on my sleeping mattress. The hike up must have made me tired, because I fell asleep quickly. As soon as I woke up though, I felt off. I didn't know why. It was the middle of the night, and pitch black inside the tent. All I could hear were the insects chirping outside, and a calm breeze blowing against the walls of the tent. I kind of just laid there for a while, maybe like 30 seconds, as my eyes were open, but completely unable to see anything. Then my eyes started to adjust a little. I could see faint outlines of the things inside my tent, and as I moved my eyes around, they fell on the zipper. The tent flap was open, and between the opening, there was a shape. I must have stared at it for a whole 4 or 5 seconds, as my heart rate spiked, before my vision became just clear enough for me to make out a pair of eyes looking into mine. My adrenaline flooded through me, and my instincts took over. I grabbed my can of bear spray that I had laying next to me and shot it right at the opening. They yelled, and I could hear his footsteps moving away from the tent as I started tearing up and coughing. I fumbled through my backpack to get my pocket knife. Then I jumped out, fully prepared to fight for my life. But the man was gone. I didn't even know which direction he went or anything, but I didn't waste any time. I hurried to gather my things and used my handheld GPS to lead me back to the car without having to take the trail. I called police to come out and take me home because by then my eyes were burning from the bear spray. They didn't find anything, but I don't know how much they searched. Whoever that was and what they wanted, I honestly couldn't tell you. With the image of that guy staring into my tent burned into my head, I won't be out camping again for a long time. This was a long time ago, when I was 13. It was summer. I spent pretty much all day playing on my PS3 or watching whatever was on TV. Sometimes I'd go outside or hang with some friends, but it was raining this day, so I was hunkered down inside. My dad always worked until 10, and my mom was a nurse, so her schedule was all over the place. Most of this day, I was playing on the PS3, but around 7-ish, I went to the kitchen to make food. While I was in there, a knock came at the front door. I didn't really want to answer, and as a kid, I was always nervous when someone was at the door, so I waited a minute and tried to just be quiet until they left. After they knocked several more times though, I snuck over to the door and looked out the peephole to see if maybe it was a neighbor or someone else I knew. I was really confused though, and kind of alarmed to see a police officer. He was standing on our porch, looking around and waiting for me to answer, and now I felt like I had to. I opened the door. It was still cold and rainy outside, and the officer was drenched. Being a kid, my eyes were immediately drawn toward the gun on his hip, and overall, I just felt scared or like I was in trouble. He asked my name, then reassured me that everything was okay and I didn't have anything to worry about. He then smiled, as if trying to keep me calm, but his teeth were noticeably rotting and yellow, which then got me to notice how overall unkempt he looked. Like, usually cops were well put together, so this was really off-putting. He definitely noticed my hesitation though, because he tried to speed up the conversation, saying he needed to search the home. I was terrified and confused, but I knew something was wrong, and that's when I noticed that there was no police car by my house. Especially with it raining, all these red flags piled up, and just as he was starting to step forward, I slammed the door and locked it. He didn't even try to say anything else. He immediately slammed something against the door, hard enough to shake the entire door and push me back a little. Thinking the door would give out, I ran to the home phone and dialed 911. I was freaking out so much, I'm surprised the operator even understood a word I said. The guy outside didn't give up the whole time though, and was even there still, banging on the door when the actual police showed up. I heard him trying to convince them he was a real cop, but obviously that didn't go well. He was taken in, and initially my parents didn't tell me much about the charges, probably for my own safety. But a few years later, they told me that during the interrogation, the man admitted to attempting to kidnap me. Had I been any more trusting, I don't know where I'd be right now.
I used to work for Domino's quite some years ago when I was 18. One night I was out making deliveries and I had finally stumbled to the last house of the night. I was ready to get the night over with as it was getting late and I had school the next morning. The house was only a few miles from town and maybe 6 or 7 miles from the Domino's that I worked at. but the property I was delivering to and the atmosphere around the area made me feel like I was in the boonies. When I pulled into the driveway, right away, I felt a shiver fly up my spine. I got this dysphoric-like feeling in my chest too. I just remember feeling very unpleasant. The driveway was a very long and narrow gravel driveway that stretched for probably a quarter mile. It looked like nothing short of a black hole from the end of the driveway before I pulled in. There were tons and tons of trees on both sides of the driveway, and the tree line on each side sat no more than 5 feet from the driveway, making it all the more eerie and dark. I sat at the end of the driveway for a brief moment as I was trying to get myself in check, because if I'm being honest, it was downright creepy and I was spooked. It didn't help that it was almost 10 o'clock at night and I kept hearing something before me in the trees. I realized that it was probably just some sort of animal, but still, it was an uncomfortable situation to be in for me. I remember hearing an owl whistling as well. It's hard to explain the way I felt. I just had such a bad feeling about the whole situation that lied ahead of me. But I had to deliver the pizza. There was no question about it. If I went back to my boss with the pizza and he found out that I didn't deliver it because I was scared, there is no doubt in my mind that he would have fired me. So I reminded myself that I was just overthinking and that everything was going to be okay. That all I had to do was drop the pizza off on the porch, as the customer already paid for it online, along with the tip. As I crept my way down the driveway and I got closer to the house, I saw a man sitting on the front porch, smoking a cigarette. The only light I could see that was coming from the house was the outside porch light, and the man was sitting directly under it. He hit his cigarette one last time and started walking over to me. As I was gathering his food and drinks, he had already made it to my car by the time I stepped out. "Hello, sir, how are you? I got here as quick as I could," I said. Then the man stared at me for what felt like way longer than he did, with a very irritated look on his face. He asked me why I was sitting at the end of his driveway for 5 minutes, and I sort of tripped over my words as he caught me off guard. At this point, he was standing directly in front of me and he ripped the pizza from my hands. Then he started complaining about how the pizza was cold. I was confused on how he knew I was sitting at the end of the driveway for a few minutes, as there is no way he could have saw me from the porch. Thinking about it now, I suppose he could have heard me, or maybe he had cameras that surveillance his property. But in the moment, I was thinking on my feet, and I didn't want to upset the customer further. I just really wanted to get out of there. So I told him that I had no clue what he was talking about. The look on his face became even more distraught when I said that, and he told me that he hates liars. Then I noticed someone who came from the inside of the house that was walking in our direction, and then 2 others who were walking from the backside of the house towards us as well. My adrenaline amped up to 1,000, and at this point, it was either fight or flight. I knew for a fact that something bad was going to happen if I didn't get out of there. I sat the rest of the food down, along with the 2-liter that he ordered, and I ran to the driver's side door so I could speed away and get the hell out of there. But as soon as I opened the car door, one of the guys grabbed my head and smashed it on the car window, and I fell to the ground. Then the man made me hand my wallet and phone over. They told me to get out of here and that if I told anybody, like the police, about what happened, that they would come for me and my family. They had my ID, so they knew where I lived, and that's just not something I wanted to risk. Luckily, I only had about $70 in my wallet. The rest of my money was in my bank account, so as soon as I got home, I asked to borrow my girlfriend's phone. I called the 24/7 hotline number to cancel all of my cards and report them stolen. That way they wouldn't be able to have access to my money. I got a new ID and everything was okay. For anyone reading this that does any sort of delivery driving, at night especially, please stay safe out there and listen to your gut no matter what. It might just save your life. It was a cold and windy night, and I was out working. I used to work as a pizza delivery driver part-time when I first got out of school. I needed money really bad, and delivering pizza was a relatively easy thing to do. And at the time, I was actually quite happy with the amount of money I was getting. It wasn't much, but it was more than enough at the time, as I still lived with my parents, and the only thing I had to pay for was my phone bill. Anyways, it was getting late, and this was probably going to be my last delivery of the night, depending on how fast I could get it done, that is. When I arrived at the house, I walked up to the front steps and I knocked on the door. There was nothing unusual going on just yet. They had the main door wide open, with the screen door cracked open as well. I waited for about a solid minute, and I politely knocked again. This time though, a little bit louder. I wanted to be sure that they heard me this time. I heard music playing in the background, so I was thinking that they probably just didn't hear me. I waited for another minute or so, but still, nobody came to the door. I knocked 2 more times with about a minute between each time, and still, no answer. I was in shock, as this wasn't something that happened to me frequently. Usually when I arrived at a house and I knocked on the door, the customer would be there in less than a minute. Just as I was about to knock for the last time, I noticed a piece of paper that had been stuck in between the door. I decided to grab it and read it. The piece of paper said, "Please deliver the pizza to the back door and knock loud and hard," with a smiley face on it. Right away, I picked that up as a red flag, but at the same time, I convinced myself I was overthinking. I almost just left the pizza on their front porch, but I didn't want them calling and complaining to the store about it being cold when they finally found the pizza. What the hell, I'll just do it. At that point, I had been waiting for almost 10 minutes, and I was genuinely starting to get irritated. As I made my way around the house, the closer I got to the back door, the louder the music became, and that's when I noticed they were having a little campfire outside. However, there was nobody outside, so I slowly walked up the back patio steps, and I knocked on the door sort of hard, just like the paper had said to do. As I waited for somebody to come to the door, I was growing more and more impatient. I was just about to say screw it and just leave the pizza on the deck and get the hell out of there. But out of nowhere, I heard a loud noise in the house, and briefly after that I heard screaming, from both a woman and a man. It sounded like they were getting into it with each other pretty bad, and I wasn't sure what to do. I waited for a few minutes and the screaming continued. It was only getting worse as time went on, and I was really starting to get concerned. It really seemed like someone was getting hurt in there. More than likely, the man was physically assaulting the woman, and that's what it sounded like to me. Right as I was about to call the police, the man came running over to the back door and he grabbed the pizza from me. And he also apologized to me and said that he was sorry for the wait. I told him it was no big deal, and I asked him if everything was okay. He was trying his best to act normal, but the way he gave me a response, and from what I was hearing a few minutes prior, I knew he was lying to my face, right through his teeth. "Look man, here's $50, please just accept my money and go. What's going on here is between me and her, and it's none of your concern." I then looked at him with a really unsettling look, and I told him that I didn't want his money, and I started walking away, already knowing that in the back of my head I was going to call the police when I got in my car. When I made it back to my car in the driveway, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, the woman came storming outside in my direction and started begging for help. She had been beaten so horribly you would not believe it. Both of her eyes were so swelled up that you could barely even see her left eye at all. She was crying and she had bruises all over her body, and she was bleeding from her nose and her stomach. She told me that he had sliced her stomach with a knife and that he threatened her with a gun. She said she managed to get away from him by hitting him in the head with a hammer. She then ran to the other side of my car and got in the passenger seat and told me to drive off. She was freaking out and screaming, telling me that we needed to leave before he came out there and killed us both. She was literally begging and screaming that I helped her get out of there. So we drove off and she called the police using my phone. I took her with me back to my work, and my boss was very understanding after I told him the situation. I ended up quitting the very next day though, as it was just too much for me to cope with. I thought that I was better off looking for a different job, something that would be safer, you know. The woman who I rescued, Angela, called the police with my phone as soon as she got in the car, like I said. But by the time the cops arrived, Tom was dead. The man killed himself by shooting himself in the head. Tom had been abusing Angela for years, and she had no way of escaping it. She didn't have a phone or any friends in the area, and he had been keeping complete control over her for the past 2 years. Apparently she was pregnant, and Tom didn't want to be a father yet, and that's what started the argument in the first place. He most definitely tried to kill the baby, but to no avail. Angela and I now are good friends, and we have each other on Facebook. I reached out to her recently to ask her how things were going, and she said she couldn't be happier and that she's in a new relationship with someone that truly loves her and cares for her. She even sent me some pictures of her and her daughter, and they seem to be in a much better spot now, which makes me happy. I worked as a pizza delivery driver at my local pizzeria for a decent amount of time in my late teenage years. It was almost 11 o'clock at night, and my manager asked me if I could do this one last delivery for the night, even though we usually wouldn't do deliveries past 10:30. It was a Saturday night, and we were much busier than usual, so I agreed. After all, I really couldn't have told him no, even if I wanted to. I got in my old beat-up 2008 Pontiac Grand Prix, and I turned some music on to help me stay awake, as I was getting really tired, and I was just ready to go the hell home. I live in a small town, so I knew the area very well, like the back of my hand. Ironically enough, I've actually never delivered around this area before. It was a few miles out of town, and I'm positive it would have technically been a different jurisdiction, or at the very least a whole different township. As I was getting closer to the house, I realized how unfamiliar the area was, but it didn't bother me much. When I got there, my GPS told me I had arrived, but I was still about a quarter mile away from the house. I was really confused, so I kept driving until I saw the next house. I was literally in the middle of nowhere, so I figured it was just the GPS being glitchy or whatever. Like I said, I stopped at the next house, hoping that it would be the correct address. I pulled into the driveway, but the driveway was super long, and I didn't want to drive all the way up to the house and have it be a total stranger that didn't even order a pizza. So I stepped out of my car and I looked to see if there was an address on the mailbox, and there was. It was definitely the address I had in my GPS, so that gave me a lot of relief. I headed down the driveway slowly, and I don't know why, but I parked my car about halfway up the driveway, and I walked the rest of the way up to the house. I knocked on the door and I waited for a few minutes, but nobody answered. I knocked once more and waited, and still, no answer. I was upset because that meant I pretty much just wasted all that time for nothing, because my job really relied on tips. I put the pizza on their front porch and I started walking back to my car. I picked up my pace a bit because it was really dark on their property and they didn't have any of the outside lights on, so I had no source of light whatsoever. Before I got to my car, as I was walking, I started hearing footsteps that sounded like it was coming from the back of the house. I could hear the leaves crunching and the sticks snapping with every step that they took. I didn't know who or what it was, but I really didn't want to stay long enough to find out. I got back in my car and I started it, and I slowly started backing out. There wasn't really any room for me to do a U-turn unless I were to drive all the way up the driveway and turn around, and I really didn't want to do that. Anyways, as I was backing up, I was too busy looking behind me to make sure I was following along the driveway. But when I turned my head back around, there was a man that had some sort of wolf mask on, and he was chasing me. I practically floored it immediately as he was running quite fast, and I didn't want him catching up to me. The driveway had a decent sized curve to it, and I sort of slid off the gravel and I hit the mailbox, and I almost ran straight into the ditch. The man called up to me and he tried to open the passenger side door, but I had locked it before he could open it. And then I drove off. I drove back to the restaurant, all while trying to figure out what I should do and if I should call the police or not, but I chose not to. I didn't tell anyone at work about what happened either. I was worried they wouldn't believe me and that my boss would think I made up a story to cover up the fact that I hit their mailbox and completely knocked it over. The strangest thing about this story is I never heard anything afterwards. I kind of thought that someone would call and complain to the restaurant about me hitting the mailbox. But the more that time goes on, the more I realize that I don't think the man with the mask lived there. And I had a feeling that the house was either vacant or foreclosed, or the people that lived there just simply weren't home. Either way, I'm almost 100% positive that the man with the wolf mask didn't order a pizza with the intentions of eating it. I think he had a more devious plan.
I'm a truck driver, and I work for a company that finds me deliveries to do. They schedule everything with all the other companies, and I just pick up and deliver whatever and whenever I'm told. It can get pretty stressful sometimes when I get booked for a lot of shorter deliveries back to back, but this one was a long cross-country delivery, so I was looking forward to just driving and not worrying too much about anything else. I was heading from the West Coast to the East Coast and was on my second full day. I was planning on driving from 12 p.m. to 12 a.m. I'm not too picky on where I sleep. I usually just pull off at the nearest truck stop, so there was no need to plan exactly what town to pull off in. Around 9 p.m., I made my last stop for the night at a small gas station. I filled up the tank and got some off-brand caffeinated drink to try out, then got back in the truck and pulled out. Now I just had 3 more hours to go, and with the roads being a lot more clear, it shouldn't be too bad. I turned on some country music and just stared at the road, mostly spacing out or thinking about whatever came to mind. Then, I want to say it was around 11 p.m., a sudden scratchy noise startled me out of my head. It was the radio. I had it on the same channel as other truckers, which we often use to chat while driving, though usually that's only during the day. I can't remember the last time someone was talking through it at night. I looked in my mirrors and didn't see any nearby trucks, and there was nobody in front of me either. Before I could grab the walkie though, the scratchy noise came back, and there was a quick instant where I could hear a voice. It was only a split second, but it sounded like they were either saying hello or help before it cut out again. There's obviously a big difference between the two, so I quickly grabbed the radio and asked if someone needed something. I waited for a while, holding the radio and listening to the soft buzzing noise coming from it. There was something unnerving building up inside of me as I continued to wait, and still got no response. But then my headlights lit up something on the road ahead. I slowed down, and once I saw that it wasn't moving, I pulled off to the side and stopped. There was a semi-truck parked right in the middle of this one-lane highway. I knew this had to be the one I heard through the radio, as there were no other trucks out here. The way it was dangerously parked on the road was concerning, and I knew something was wrong. I thought maybe they had a sudden heart attack or stroke or something. I don't know, it sounds kind of crazy, but that would have explained the sudden stop and call for help. I stepped out and started walking up to it. The whole road was quiet, with only the sound of the grass rustling in the wind from the endless fields on either side of the highway. I called out a few times as I hurried up, but never got a response. Then I got up to the door, which was open, and looked inside. My heart sank, and I could feel the fear creeping up inside of me. No one was in the truck. There was a jacket slung over the passenger seat, and a half-empty coffee cup in one of the cup holders, and the radio was dangling from the ceiling, but no signs of anything having happened. It was like the driver just vanished. I quickly stepped back down onto the road and looked in all directions. The sound of the grass swaying in the wind suddenly became extremely eerie. My heart was pounding, and I made the decision to not risk staying past my welcome. I hurried back to my truck and drove off, notifying the police as I did. They found the truck still there, parked in the middle of the road, and still no signs of the driver anywhere. After investigating, they figured out who was driving it and reported him as missing. They also found evidence of 3 other vehicles having been parked in the grass right by the spot the semi was at, though obviously I never saw them, and there was no way to know exactly why they were there. The search was pretty extensive for the missing driver, but they never found even a clue as to where he is, so it's very unlikely he'll ever be seen again. But whatever happened to that other trucker very well could have been me had I been the first to arrive at that area. Since then, I've been hyper aware of any sketchy situations and hope to never be involved in something like that again. I was en route for an overnight delivery. Where I was driving, it was mostly empty roads. The only other people that were on the roads at this time of night were other delivery drivers. The night was going well though, nothing interesting for the first several hours. Around 2 a.m., I stopped at a truck station to fill up and use the restroom, as the next little bit was going to be a long stretch through dense forest roads with very few places to stop at, if any. As I was driving along, and just about an hour or so after my last stop, I randomly saw something ahead. I only had a few seconds to get a good look before passing by, but there was a person standing on the side of the road. Again, if I wasn't already clear, there was absolutely nothing but dense, unpopulated forest with no other roads or anything. So seeing a person standing out here without a car anywhere in sight was really strange. In the few seconds I looked at them though, they never waved at me, or yelled for help, or tried to get my attention in any way. I couldn't stop thinking about it as I drove for another mile before I suddenly saw another person. Standing on the side of the road, there was a woman this time. She was wearing ripped jeans and a red sweatshirt, and as I passed by, we made eye contact, and she just stared at me. No smile, no frown, just an empty face. It was extremely disturbing, enough to make me literally shiver. I looked in the mirror after passing them and could see their head follow my truck before they were covered up by the dark. When I looked back at the road though, my heart almost stopped and I slammed on the brakes. I could feel the whole weight of the semi pushing forward as I abruptly came to a stop. Right in the center of the road, there was a body. It was laying flat across the street, though I couldn't tell if they were alive or not. They weren't moving, but I also didn't see any signs of an accident. Like there was nothing else on the road, and the way that they were positioned, it didn't look like a car had hit them, or anything like that. I felt like I needed to check if they were okay, but also I had this really bad feeling about whatever this was. I mean, seeing 3 people out here in just the span of a mile is a crazy coincidence. I looked around at the forest covering either side of me, and this sense I had only continued to grow. After being stopped for a whole minute, I put it back in drive and carefully drove around the body. My heart was still racing, and when I finally got around them and started back on the road, I checked my mirrors one last time. The body wasn't on the ground anymore. They were standing up and watching me drive away. My eyes were peeled for the rest of that drive, as I was genuinely terrified. I didn't see any more people along the road though. I think that it was a setup of some kind. They were probably trying to get me to stop and check on them, but clearly they weren't dead or injured, so what they would have done, I really don't know. Seeing those other people before though, there's no saying how many others could have been around, or even literally sitting in the forest right next to me, just waiting for me to get out of my truck. Even just rethinking about that night still creeps me out. I was driving from Omaha, Nebraska to Fargo, North Dakota. It's actually a regular route for me that I do a couple times a month. Personally, I love it. The whole drive is through flat farmland that's super easy to drive through, and there's barely any traffic to deal with. Doing the route so often, I always took the same stops. The halfway point that I'd always stop to sleep at was a truck stop that sat in between two really small towns in South Dakota. This truck stop was abnormally large, and since there were very few truckers taking this route, it was almost always empty. Maybe 2 or 3 other trucks, and that's it. Anyway, the first day of driving went well, and I'd arrived at this truck stop just after 1 a.m., but something was immediately wrong. The building that was there was completely boarded up, and all the gas pumps looked like they were ripped out of the ground, and all the lights that should have been lighting up the lot were off. It had been shut down and abandoned. I couldn't say I was surprised, but this really threw off my routine, and now I either had to drive for another hour or try sleeping at this dark, abandoned lot. Now, on any other day, I probably would have just said screw it and slept there, but for some reason this night, I didn't even consider it. I immediately pulled back onto the highway and continued driving, only to quickly regret my decision as I struggled to keep my eyes open. I made it a very unimpressive 15 more minutes before pulling onto the gravel on the side of the road and trying to slap myself back awake. While I was there, I looked out the windows. I was in the middle of nowhere, and honestly, I knew this was a bad idea, but I figured there was no point in dangerously driving while sleepy and tired, when I could just sleep here. I know other truckers did it all the time, so I felt comfortable enough to try it. I shut off the engine and locked the doors, then put my window covers up and leaned the seat back. Maybe I underestimated how comfortable I was, because my body just wouldn't allow me to fall asleep. I laid there for probably 20 minutes, just waiting to drift off, and that's when I heard something. It was a small squeak, like from an old car braking somewhere behind my trailer. I leaned forward and turned my head to listen. Very faintly, there was the sound of a car's engine humming. I was really confused, but hoped that it was just a police car checking up on me. I took down the window shade and looked at the side mirror. I couldn't tell exactly what kind of car it was, but it definitely wasn't a cop car. I only had a few seconds to think through things before I heard someone call out. They just said hey, but it terrified me. Thinking I had to leave, I turned the truck on. These things aren't exactly fast to start up, and as soon as they heard the engine start going, I could hear their footsteps start sprinting. They got right up to the passenger door and started aggressively pulling on the handle. Just as I started moving, they jumped up and held on to the door as they stared at me through the window. This guy looked like he was early 40s, with a long, bushy white and brown beard, and had a dark hoodie over his head. He banged on the window as I continued to pull onto the highway, and right when I started to gain some speed, he shattered the window. My eyes shot over at the broken glass, but outside the door, the man was gone. In the mirror, I saw him rolling on the road, either from jumping off or losing his grip. I continued picking up my speed until I could no longer see him or his car. Thankfully, he didn't seem to try to chase me. I called the cops, but they were so far away that by the time they got there, it had already been 35 minutes, and the only thing left at the scene were the shards of glass on the road. Had that guy been a few seconds earlier to breaking the window, he probably would have had enough time to reach in and open the door, and I can only imagine what would have happened next. Here's a lesson to everyone to leave as soon as you feel something is wrong, because every second could be the difference between getting away or never getting away. My name is Leo, and I work for a pizza shop in my small town. I don't do deliveries or anything, but I do mostly everything there is to do inside the shop. I make pizzas, organize the stations, clean, and get all the closing tasks done every night before I leave. My interactions with customers is usually pretty minimal, since we have a few high school kids to take orders and everything, but they're only scheduled until 11 on weekdays. The shop closes at 12:30, so any orders or customers that come in after that, I have to take care of. This was a regular Monday shift. Everything went smoothly for the most part, and at 11 my coworker left, so it was just me to close up. It's usually really slow, so I started the cleanup process. About a half hour before closing, a call came in. Praying it wasn't for a last-minute order, I picked up the phone. I said my generic "thanks for calling, how can I help you" line, and right after I finished, there was a quiet pause. Then they hung up. I put the phone down and said a few choice words, thinking it was a prank call from a couple immature kids. I went back to the kitchen where I was cleaning, but not even 30 seconds later, I heard the bell ring by the door. The timing was annoying, but I put everything back down and walked back to the front. A guy was now standing at the counter. He had a heavy coat on and a black beanie over his shaggy hair. His eyes were what really put me off though. He had dark circles and bags, like he hadn't slept in days, yet his eyes were wide open. How can I help you?" I said, standing a couple feet from the counter. "I'd like to place an order right now." The way he said it was odd, and it very obviously told me that something was wrong with him. I said okay and asked what he wanted, but it almost seemed like he wasn't expecting me to say that. His eyes just continued to hold this disturbing stare at me as he struggled to respond. I looked away out of uncomfort, but my eyes fell on his hand that was partially out of his jacket pocket. He was holding a knife, like a typical kitchen knife. I think he was trying to hide it, but I could see the handle in his hand, and part of the blade was sticking out of his pocket. I felt my stomach drop and blood rush from my face, almost like I was gonna faint. I looked back up, and his eyes were still staring at me, but his face was stiff and emotionless. The sound of the door opening made both of us jump, and both of us looked over. It was some other random customer walking into the shop, and they immediately seemed to realize something was wrong. They stopped in place, stumbling over a few words, before the guy by the register suddenly walked past him and out the door. I used the phone to call 911 and tried to explain to the other customer what had happened. We also watched out the window as the guy got into his car and sped out of the parking lot. That was the last we saw of him, though. What I think happened was he parked outside the shop and watched in the window as he called us. Once he saw that it was me answering the phone, I guess he knew I was alone, so that's when he walked in. If not for the random customer walking inside in that moment, I don't know what would have happened. He was clearly insane and armed with a kitchen knife, so it couldn't have been good. Since then, I still haven't seen him come back, and I really hope I never do.
It was the middle of summer and my parents had left for the weekend to go to our house in Cape Cod. It's about a 2-hour drive away, so it's no big deal for them to leave me alone for a few days. My mom had made some pulled pork and pasta for me to heat up to eat whenever, and I had some money if I wanted to order a pizza. Things were all good, and the first night I was alone, I stayed up till 3 in the morning playing Xbox, so I woke up really late the next day. I checked my phone when I woke up, and I saw it was a little bit past 1. I had made plans to play some street hockey with my friends at about 3, so I threw myself out of bed and stumbled into the shower. I take really long showers, so when my parents are gone, I go mental. I was in there for about 45 minutes on my phone, scrolling through Reddit and Twitter and whatnot, when I heard one of the doors open. The bathroom is directly up the stairs from the back door, and the door is pretty loud when it opens and closes. Same with the front door. I immediately froze, since obviously I was supposed to be alone. I waited for about 2 minutes, trying to hear anything else. I figured it was just the wind, or maybe my parents were home early, so I turned off the shower, wrapped my towel around myself, and slowly walked down the stairs to check it out. Even though my house is old as shit, and each step on the stairs makes a super loud creak, I still took my time and tried to be as quiet as possible. I probably took 45 seconds walking down all 12 of those stairs. So when I get to the second to last stair, right before I could see around the corner into the kitchen, I take a little breath to compose myself. In my mind, I knew I was probably being stupid and dramatic. There obviously wasn't anything in the kitchen. There's no way I wouldn't have heard another noise, and there's no reason for them to still be in the kitchen, even if there were burglars or something in the house. After sort of mentally chastening myself for being such a wuss, I sort of chuckled to myself for being so stupid, and I just normally walked the last 2 stairs and turned the corner into the kitchen. Standing about 2 feet away from me in the middle of my kitchen is a man staring straight at me perfectly still, with a massive smile across his face. The thing I remember most vividly wasn't his face or his smile, but his arms. They weren't just at his side. He held them in the most strange, abnormal position I've ever seen. They were where one would normally hold their arms, but he had rotated them to the point to where they were almost completely reversed, as well as lifting them up and a little bit behind himself. It's hard to explain what I mean. I don't know why I remember this so much, but it's just the most demonic, abnormal position I've ever seen. Honest to God, I think I almost had a heart attack right there. Looking back, I can realize how creepy this situation was, but in the moment I just took a step towards him and I punched him as hard as I could in the jaw, sort of half slapping and pushing him towards the ground. The second I connected, I beelined it up the stairs, dropping my towel in the kitchen with my heart beating out of control. I sprinted into my room and I locked the door behind me. I quickly put up a chair against the doorknob. Almost without thinking, I also immediately called 911 and, nearly in tears, I told the operator what happened. As I sat on the floor of my room, in practically the fetal position, staring at the door, praying that a cop would be here as soon as possible, I noticed the light coming from the gap between my door had stopped. The guy was standing outside of my door. There's no words to describe the feeling I had. I was paralyzed with fear, watching the shadow across the bottom of the door shift in different ways. I stayed balled up, staring at the gap, praying the man would go away for what seemed like an hour. All the while, the 911 operator was asking, "Hello, sir, sir, are you there? Hello?" But I didn't want to make a noise. And even if I wanted to move my arms to bring the phone to my mouth, I don't think I could have. Eventually, the light returned to the gap and I heard the faintest of footsteps, slowly creaking the wooden floorboards as he walked down the hall. It was silent for minutes as I just sat there curled up, unable to even speak. I heard banging on the front door and the sound of 2 officers entering my house. I finally felt safe, and I opened the door to the 2 of them standing there. I almost cried. Nowadays, my parents don't leave me home alone anymore, thank God, and I check every lock in the house before going to bed. I still get nightmares occasionally, and my heart starts racing whenever I see someone standing still, but I'm doing alright. Even working with sketch artists and a few lineups, the police never found whoever was in my house. That sends shivers down my spine every time I look outside, half expecting to see him standing across the street, smiling under a lamppost. I have no idea what he wanted or who he was, but regardless, maybe that's for the better. So I've had quite a few bad experiences with strange people in my house. From when I was young, an old man would come banging on our door late at night, demanding to see me, causing me to have to hide in the house. Or once when a man came knocking on our door late at night with a knife, because he mistook our house for my neighbor's. These experiences all caused me to be very cautious about opening the front door to anyone, or even being in the house alone, especially at night. But one evening was definitely the worst. It was around 6 p.m. in November of 2018. I'm from England, meaning it was already pitch black outside at this time of the year. I had just got home from work and I was sitting in my room upstairs, just watching YouTube on my laptop. My mom shouted up to me that she was just going to pick my brother up from work and would be stopping off at the gas station on the way back, so she would be gone for a little bit, and asked if I wanted to come. I said no and I carried on with my video. I heard her close the front door and pull out of the driveway. I was 17 at the time, so being home alone at night was nothing new to me and I was used to the eerie feeling of it. But after around 10 minutes, I started hearing noises coming from downstairs. At first I thought nothing of it and I just related it to my cat, noisily searching for food in an empty bowl. Until I remembered him sitting at the end of my bed. I paused my video and I listened more at the sound of the banging on my back door. This instantly creeped me out, until it was followed by the sound of keys dangling and I just thought, oh, my mom must have dropped my brother off before going to the station and he's just trying to go outside. So I let the noise continue as I kept watching my video. He can get quite angry at times, so the loud banging was nothing out of the ordinary, but it just kept carrying on. Banging and the sounds of keys dangling, then dropping, then banging again. Then the fear really hit me. I don't think it's him. I walked out of my room slowly and sat on the stairs, listening carefully to the noise. It definitely wasn't him. I'm an extremely anxious person, and everyone gets those times late at night when they hear noises and immediately think the worst. This was just one of those, I told myself. So I decided to bite the bullet and just walk straight into the kitchen and face whatever it was that was causing the noise. Our kitchen has the door facing straight to the garden. But as I turned the corner into the kitchen, I heard a loud bang and clatter of footsteps run away. The cat flap had been ripped off the door and there was plastic from it everywhere. In fear, I still tried to console myself into thinking it could have been anything other than people breaking in. I sat back on the stairs and called my mom just to check again that it wasn't my brother home early and just in a bad mood. But then he answered my mom's phone while still in the car. "Are you home?" I shouted at him. Then my voice started to break with terror. "Please be serious. Are you home right now?" I asked. "No. What do you want?" he said. Even though he said he wasn't, I still begged in my mind that he was joking, just to scare the shit out of me. But he heard how scared I was and began to worry. I explained to him what happened and he started to scream at me to call the police. He's never been the protective type, but I could tell now he was really worried and told my mom to rush back home straight away. While calling for the police, I tried so hard to stay calm. I told them exactly what was happening as I hid back in my room with the door tightly locked. Then I heard talking and the banging of doors downstairs again. They were back. I bursted into tears to the dispatcher out of pure fear, and I sat on the phone for what felt like forever until my mom, brother, and police all pulled up at the same time. Everyone charged through the house to the back door, and we instantly saw what they had done. The people saw the keys to the back door on the side in the kitchen, took a broom from outside, broke it in half on the door handle, got the broom through the cat flap, knocked the keys off the side, and pulled them through the cat flap. Although out of pure luck, as they broke the broom in half, they also managed to snap off the door handle, making it completely impossible for it to be opened from the outside. Otherwise, they would have gotten in, no questions asked, and I would have been sitting quietly in my room, completely oblivious. It was clear afterward that they had been watching the house for a while, waiting until the exact moment that they saw my mom's car pull out of the drive. I'm not sure if they knew I was there alone or not, but I know that after they initially saw me and ran away, they made a choice to come back. This happened several years ago when I lived with my ex-boyfriend. So we had been living there for roughly 1 month when this event occurred. My ex was out with work colleagues and I was home alone. I spent the early evening watching TV and eating takeout. A couple of times I heard some strange noises, but whenever I would try to zone in on them to figure out what the hell it was, it seemed like it would stop. It got later into the night and I decided to go upstairs and use the computer for a little while before heading to bed. At this point in time, we hadn't had our phone line installed and I was still on a pay-and-go phone which had run out of credit. I basically had no way to communicate with anyone while I was in the house for the night. So I'm sitting in the bedroom with only a small table lamp on that barely forms a glow while I'm typing away on my laptop when I started to hear weird noises again. It started as a light rattling noise and like really faint to the point where I had to strain to hear if I was really hearing it or imagining it. I shut my music off and I tried to figure out what it was. I went into our bedroom and looked down to the front door, but nobody is there. We had a small yard with a high brick wall and a solid wooden gate with nothing to cast any light. But from what little I could see, there was nothing out back either. I sat back down and I switched the music back on. I would say about 10 minutes later, I hear this very eerie screeching sound like metal on metal, again very faint, as if whatever was making it was trying desperately to be quiet. I was getting more than a little freaked out by this point, so I went into our bedroom to retrieve this heavy iron rod that we found in the back of the built-in wardrobe. I didn't switch on any lights as I didn't know what was going on, and I didn't want to alert any possible intruder to my location inside the house. Remember, I had no way of calling anyone, and I was getting more than a little concerned that someone might actually be in my house. I headed into the bathroom to see if I could get a better look into the alley that the house backed onto. The office and bedroom and the bathroom formed an L around the yard, with the bathroom extending further out. I climbed up onto the ledge and inched the window open to try to see out into the alley. I couldn't see a thing, but the whispering was louder and coming from directly behind my gate. I couldn't hear whole sentences, but I heard enough to summarize whoever these men were and that they'd seen us move in and had seen we had quite a lot of valuable equipment, like guitars, computers, my DSLR, TV, game consoles, etc. I imagine they had seen I was home alone and they were waiting for me to go to sleep, to try to get into the house. I stayed perched there for what felt like an eternity until what seemed like the loudest thud in the world echoed up to me. I guess they grew tired of trying to be stealthy and one or both of them were throwing themselves at my gate trying to break it down. I could see it shuddering under the blows and could only imagine how large these men must be. I'm a tiny girl, all of a whole 5'3", and at that point I probably weighed somewhere around 105 pounds. As you can imagine, I was white with terror as I watched my gate groan under the stress. I sat clutching that iron rod just trying to think where I could hide from them. Suddenly, a glaring light blinded me. At first, I panicked and dropped out of sight, thinking they were shining a flashlight at the back of the house. But then I heard barking and shouting. I peeked out again and I saw the house, which was across the alley from us, had a floodlight installed, and it was illuminating both their own yard, mine and the alleyway, with light. I heard grumbling and cursing, and then 2 sets of footsteps hurrying down the alley. I stayed locked in that bedroom until my ex-boyfriend drunkenly rolled in at about 4 a.m. I didn't sleep a wink that night, and when I went into the yard in the morning, my gate was hanging by one hinge, allowing easy access from the alley. When I looked at the back of it, the keyhole was covered in scratches, as if someone had tried to force the lock. If they hadn't woken the house behind us, I dread to think what could have happened. This happened well over 10 years ago, so I will try my best to describe the events accurately. One of my childhood homes had a balcony that was attached to both my mother's bedroom and mine, via big double glass doors in each one of our rooms. Next to the balcony are two trees. One I used to often climb up and down from the balcony. This balcony faced out to the street. I was a 13-year-old girl at the time of this story. One night, when my brother and mother weren't home, I was reading in bed with a very dim reading light. I heard what sounded like something moving in one of the trees outside, but this didn't worry me as possums and bats are common in our area. Now I had thin curtains covering the glass doors that separated my room and the balcony. As mentioned previously, the doors faced out towards the street where the street lamp light was almost always visible through my curtains. Shortly after hearing the tree rustling noises, I see a shadow slowly move past the doors, at which point I immediately turn off my reading light and freeze like a deer in headlights. The shadow was tall, so it wasn't one of the neighbor kids that I'm friends with, and it wasn't my 5-foot mother. The person moved slowly, creeping as though they were trying not to be noticed. They wouldn't likely be able to see into my room, but I could see them thanks to the streetlights behind them, creating a dark silhouette. They moved past my doors out of sight, and I sat there unable to move, or even think about what to do, other than be absolutely still. That is until I heard another sound. The sound of someone trying to open one of the glass doors. My mom's door to the balcony. I didn't know if she had locked him or not, but I wasn't taking any chances. I moved as quickly and as silently as I could to the bedroom door and locked it. I listened for what the person was doing now, and they were still jiggling the glass door handle, but it sounded like the doors weren't opening. I felt relief, like this person couldn't get in surely. All I had to do was wait for them to realize that, and then they would leave, right? Well, I heard light footsteps move back along the balcony to my set of glass doors, till I saw his shadow stop directly in front of them. Again, I froze, knowing he couldn't see me. He didn't know I could see him though. I saw a shadow of a hand reach up to my door handle and my heart stopped. Had I actually locked those doors myself today? I mean, I was out there earlier, what if I forgot? The seconds leading up to him grabbing the handle felt like an eternity, but thankfully, when this person tried to open the door, it did not open. It was locked. I sighed such a sigh of relief. I was worried he had heard it. After this, he began pacing the length of the balcony. I didn't have a mobile phone, as my mom thought I was too young to have one yet, and the landline was at the other end of the house. But I was too scared to take my eyes off of this person, even to call for help. I was silently crying with tears falling down my cheeks as I internally prayed that they would just leave. Then I heard him stop moving. He then said, "I could just break the glass, you know." Before I could even process this, I saw car headlights turn around the corner of my street and then stop at our property gate. My mom was home. The person on the balcony moved out of sight, and I heard a loud thump as they jumped off of it. When my mom came inside, I was hysterical, and I was barely coherent in telling her what happened. Eventually, I got the message across, and she called the police. They never found or caught anyone, but a neighbor reported a truck in the street that matched the description of a truck that had been reported recently for attempted child abductions near my school a block away. Since I walked that short distance daily, the police suspected that he had followed me or seen that I lived there and waited for me to be alone. When I was 10, my parents and I went to visit my grandmother for spring break. My cousin also came to visit, and we decided we wanted to go to the YMCA for the day. My grandma dropped us off and said that she would come pick us up in 4 hours. On that day, the YMCA was empty. There were a couple of adults in the exercise room, but that's it. We went to the basketball court, and after 2 hours of playing tag and shooting baskets, we were bored. I've never been the biggest fan of swimming, but this place had a really cool pool, so we changed into our bathing suits and headed in there. The pool was empty except for the lifeguard.
We played a bunch of games and swam laps, but after about an hour, there wasn't much left to do, and there was no one except us to hang out with to keep things interesting. So we decided to play a game of seeing how long we could hold our breath underwater. We stood in the shallow end, near the clock on the wall, so we could time ourselves. Instead of fully submerging, we just stuck our heads face down in the water. We did this a couple of times, and I was winning. On our last round, I felt a tap on my shoulder. I figured it was my cousin giving up and telling me that I won, but instead, it was the lifeguard who told me to knock it off, or she was going to have to ask us to leave the pool. Since we were tired of being in the pool already, we figured we would just get out and get dressed, and go back to the basketball court, until my grandma picked us up. We only had an hour left anyways, and the water was freezing. As we got out, the lifeguard stopped us and asked if we wanted to go into the sauna to warm up and dry off. The sign said 18 years of older, so of course, we were super excited that she allowed us to do that. She walked us to the sauna and unlocked the door. The door was glass and the interior was made entirely out of wood. Inside, above the door, there was a clock, probably to help make sure you were not in there for an unsafe amount of time. The lifeguard stand was adjacent to the sauna, but if you looked out the door, you could clearly see it. She followed us in and went over to the thermometer encased in plastic and unlocked it, so she could crank up the heat. I figured that she must have to turn it on each time, so I didn't think anything of it. Both my cousin and I were very short girls, so we couldn't see the temperature that was on the thermometer knob, but I know she was turning up the heat. Then she left and shut the door behind her. I thought I saw her lock the door too, but I thought to myself, why would she lock the door when we might want to get out? I checked the clock and decided that we should get out in 10 or 15 minutes. It was already plenty warm in the sauna, but now the room was blazing. It felt nice because I was so cold from the pool. After about 15 minutes though, it was starting to get a little bit too hot, and my cousin agreed that we should leave so we can get dressed. I went to turn the knob on the door, but it wasn't budging. Thought maybe it was jammed, so I shook it, but it still wasn't opening, and then I let my cousin try. She couldn't get it open either. We figured the lifeguard would be back in a couple of minutes, so we sat back down and waited. The room was getting hotter now, and I really wanted to leave. I got up and started banging on the door and shaking and twisting the knob, trying to get the lifeguard's attention. My cousin got up and joined me. We started screaming at the top of our lungs for her to let us out, but she just stared straight ahead. I don't think there's any way that she couldn't have noticed or heard two little girls banging and kicking the door and screaming. Now we had been in there for about 25 minutes. It was so hot in the sauna that it hurt to breathe. It felt like my lungs were on fire. My eyes and skin were burning. We sat back down and put our towels over our heads because they were a little damp and it made it easier to breathe. I was so worried about my cousin, as she is a couple years younger than me. I looked at the clock and saw that we had been in there for about 35 minutes. I got up and walked up to the door again and saw the lifeguard still just staring straight ahead. Again, I tried to get her attention by screaming that we needed to get out and banging on the door as hard as I could, but nothing. I was starting to get pretty dizzy, so I went to go sit back down, but the wooden seats of the sauna burned my skin. My towel was completely dry, so I put it underneath me to sit on. My hair was also dry, but I wrapped it across my face to cover my nose, and I squinted my eyes so that they didn't burn as bad, but I could still watch if anyone walked past the door. It helped a little bit. My cousin was laying face down with a towel over her head, not moving or saying anything, so I nudged her to make sure that she was still okay. She was, but I could tell that we really need to get out of there soon, because she seemed a bit disoriented. It had been 45 minutes now, and I was extremely nauseous. There was no way that the lifeguard would forget that we were in there, and I thought she would have to come back soon. But there was this little voice in my head telling me that maybe she purposely locked us in there. Finally, a man walked past the door towards the pool, but for some reason, I just couldn't get up. My whole body was on fire and I felt dizzy. Luckily, this man wasn't going to the pool. He wanted to be let into the sauna and came back with a lifeguard. I saw them walking this way and immediately jumped up to grab my cousin. I knew now for sure that she locked us in there because she pulled out her keys to unlock the door and let the man in. I didn't want to take any chances of us being trapped in there any longer, so as the man was trying to walk in, I was trying to shove our way out. As we were going out, the lifeguard started trying to shut the door and push us back with it. The man was clearly confused about what was going on and said, I think they want out. The lifeguard let out a sigh and opened the door fully, and we ran away as fast as we could into the changing room. We only had about 10 minutes before our grandma was supposed to pick us up. We were both so shaken by what just happened that we didn't say anything to each other as we got dressed or on the car ride home. When we got back to the house, my parents were making us dinner, and I told them the story of what happened. They thought that I must have been exaggerating, and they didn't believe me. I truly think that that woman was going to let us cook alive in there. The only bit of doubt that I have is what would have happened if we actually died. She obviously would have gotten the blame. What was her end game? I'm 21 now, but I still think about this interaction all the time. And when I'm in small spaces, or I get too warm, I still have panic attacks. No one believes this story, and I get it because it's pretty absurd. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to ask for opinions, but do you think this could have been some crazy misunderstanding? Or do you think that she really just left us in there to die, and why? I used to work in a strip mall out in a fairly rural area. Most people are recognizable, even if you don't know them personally. People from out of the area frequently stop on their way through other towns. So it's not like they're never out-of-towners, just that they might be easy to spot. Like many places, we have a few homeless folks that hang around the shopping center, and they occasionally ask people for change or food. It can be a nuisance, but the folks that worked at the shops kind of kept an eye on them, to help them out or to keep track of how they were doing. There was this one guy, let's call him Shane, that over the course of years has slowly gotten in worse and worse shape. He would be filthy and was clearly not doing well mentally, and was usually intoxicated. He always had several layers of clothing, and the pants that he wore on the outside of his pants always sagged, making it hard for him to walk. He'd go missing for days and then show up again. We'd wonder what happened to Shane and ask around a bit, and a few days later he'd appear again. He was always so dirty. I always wished there was a way we could get him some help, but I didn't really know what to do. One day, I was out in a major city that is about 80 or so miles away from where I work. I happened to see a very well-dressed, very well-groomed gentleman that looked exactly like Shane. But at that moment, I figured my eyes were deceiving me. This guy has an expensive-looking shoulder bag, a new iPhone, and an Apple Watch. We were both in line at a popular food truck, and it was usually a long wait to order and get your food. Most people just mind their business and scroll on their phones while waiting. This guy, on the other hand, is staring daggers at me. I keep avoiding looking that way, but I keep glancing to see if he's still there. And at the same time, I went to look at him because I was curious about how much he looks like Shane. I glance his way, and I have to stumble back because he's practically right up against me. He has such intense eyes. He sort of whispers to me, but really intensely, and tells me he knows where I'm from and what shop I work at. He gets closer, and I can tell that he smells good, and I could even smell his minty breath. I ask how he knows, and he just smiles. I ask again, and he smiles brighter, exposing a perfectly clean set of teeth, minus one tooth. I'm almost positive Shane is missing that tooth. I edge away, feeling more than a little uncomfortable. His order gets called up, but they say his name is James. The next few days, I don't see Shane anywhere around the shopping center, and I ask around, and no one had seen him for a few days. Someone says they hope he's okay, and another person shrugs and says they wish they could do something to help him. The next day, there he is, filthy as ever, grimy teeth, dirty fingernails, and wearing all of his layers. He sits on the curb outside my shop and asks people for change. I decide to venture out and confront him. I'm 100% sure that it's him, but I don't understand how he could get so filthy and smelly in such a short time. I asked him if he was in the city, and he looks at me through bloodshot eyes and mumbles that he'll kill me if I tell anyone. This takes me aback, and I look at him puzzled. He slurs again, that he will kill me if I tell anyone that he's not actually homeless. He starts to get worked up, and I ended up calling the police because I didn't know at that point what he was capable of. He wandered off, and I haven't seen him since.
One afternoon, I got caught in a thunderstorm that led me to a scary situation. I needed to head to the local grocery store for pet food, and I also decided I would pick up dinner for myself from there as well. I have a car, but I don't care to use it too much since I prefer walking to most places. I get good exercise, and it's usually a good experience. The grocery store was a good 40-minute walk from where I live, so I left the store in the early afternoon. It was warm out and the sky was completely clear when I left. In fact, The entire time that I was walking to the store, it was nice outside. I got to the store, purchased the few items I needed, then put them in my backpack that I always carry with me. When I left the store, I was surprised by the sudden change of weather. The clear and sunny day had vanished and was replaced by a blanket of black clouds. I hadn't bothered to check the weather before leaving the house. It was so bright and sunny outside before that I didn't think I needed to, but it now looked like it could begin storming at any moment. Well, I started walking out of the parking lot, and I walked fast. Even walking quickly, it would take me at least 30 minutes to get back to my house. I couldn't run because I didn't have good shoes for that. I had a backpack on, and overall, I just wasn't a runner. I tried to hurry as much as I could, though. I had made it part of the way home, but then the thunderstorm began. There was nowhere nearby for me to take refuge as the sky began to dump sheets of rain on me. It happened so quickly, and I was completely drenched in probably less than a minute. I barely even heard it approaching through the rain, but a truck pulled over, and the man in the truck asked me if I wanted a ride. I told him that I was soaked and wet and would just get his car wet as well. He insisted, however, and eventually I gave in and I got in the truck. Now, rather than take me home, the guy just kept the truck where it was and then began talking to me. He told me that he had seen me many times, walking up and down the main street, and had always wondered if I had a car. I told him that I did, and I just explained how I enjoyed walking, and I hadn't checked the weather for the day. Finally, he took off driving. Instead of turning into my neighborhood where I directed him to, though, he pulled into a truck stop. My first thought was that he needed to get gas or buy something, but he drove around and parked in the far back of the lot. I was about to ask him what was going on, when he turned to me and abruptly said, "You know, you could take your clothes off and you wouldn't be so wet," as he placed his hand on my knee. I responded that I was fine and could change at home, asking what we were doing there and if he could please just bring me home. The man continued to stare at me and eventually said that we could just hang out for a while until the thunderstorm was over. I was feeling very uncomfortable. I had thought that this had been an act of someone being a good Samaritan, but it was clear to me now that it wasn't. I felt around for the door handle on my side, but I realized it wasn't there. I couldn't open the door and get away. The man pushed himself closer to me, and I had to find a way out of that terrifying situation. Instinctively, I did the only thing I could think of, and I punched him in the crotch as hard as I could. He screamed in agony, and that was my chance. It was disgusting, but I crawled over the guy. He kept trying to grab me, but I was able to crawl over him and open his door and get out of the truck. Slipping around on the wet pavement, I managed to run into the truck stop, even though I didn't have good running shoes. I alerted the cashier in the gas station to call the police. The guy drove off before the police got there, but they were able to pick him up later due to the description I gave them. Turns out the guy had been in jail several times for doing what he tried to do to me. Unfortunately, it wasn't enough to convict him just based on what I testified to, but I was able to get a restraining order on him. For a while afterward, it was difficult to walk out on the street. Every time a car passed by, out of the corner of my eye, I saw that truck and I got afraid. I get Chipotle quite often, and usually I go and order it at the restaurant. It's always pretty quick, and there's a Chipotle less than 10 minutes from my apartment. But a couple of months ago, I saw on the Chipotle app that I could get a free delivery. I can't remember why, but it was a limited time deal, so I decided to use it. It was a little bit later at night, maybe 9 p.m., and I had recently got home from work. Chipotle sounded great, so I ordered it and used the free delivery. After that, I went to take a shower and change. So when I was just about done in the shower, I heard a knock on the door and figured that the Chipotle was delivered. I finished showering and put my clothes on. Then I went to the door. After opening it and looking out into the hallway, I was expecting to see the food, but there was nothing there. So I went back and checked on my phone. I had no idea why else there would be a knocking on my door. Sure enough, it said that my order had in fact been delivered. This was very confusing to me. I went out and looked into the hallway again. There was definitely nothing there, and I had heard the knock on the door. So what else could it have been? I realized it was very possible somebody stole the food. If someone walking by in my hallway saw Chipotle sitting there and wanted it, they could have just took it. I called the Chipotle saying that I didn't get my order and thought that it was stolen. It was a little bit awkward, but they eventually ended up delivering another one to me. This time, I was right there at the door when it arrived. Still, I was very angry that somebody had stolen it the first time. I didn't think the people who lived in my building would do that. I mean, I knew a good number of my neighbors. I didn't know any of them really that great, but they all seemed nice. Well, after Chipotle, I went to bed. The next morning, when I left my apartment, I saw there was a note taped to the outside of my door. I took it off and read it. The note said, "Thanks for the Chipotle last night," and then there was a sort of creepy smile face on the note as well. I was disgusted when I read it. Whoever had stolen my food was now teasing me about it. I didn't know it could be done though. My apartment does not have security cameras in the hallways, and I didn't think there was any way of me being able to figure it out. I wasn't going to knock on every door and confront people about it, accusing them. So I ripped up the note and threw it away, and hoped that I would never have anything like that happen again. Well, after work that day, I cooked something at home. The next morning, I once again had another note on my door. This one said, "No food for me last night?" Once more, I was very angry. Whoever was doing this really had some nerve to keep putting notes on my door. I just threw this one in the trash as well. I went out into the hallway and looked around, but nobody was out. So fast forward to the very next night. I was at home by myself, and it was probably like 10 p.m. Out of nowhere, I heard a knocking at my door. I just had a feeling that it was the same person who had been messing with me. I mean, there was really no reason for somebody to be knocking on my door. When I heard the knocking, I happened to be in my kitchen, which is very close to the doorway. I walked right over to it and opened it up. When I did, nobody was there, but I heard footsteps quickly moving away. I looked and saw a man going around the corner where the hallway turned. I only saw him for a second, and I did not recognize him. I left my apartment and decided to go after him. I went to the corner and saw him go into the stairwell. When he did, I went in after him. However, I kept my distance and was quiet. I do not think that he knew I was following him because I was a decent ways back. After making it to the stairs, he went up one floor and then into the hallway. When I opened up the door from the stairwell, I just barely saw him entering an apartment unit. I walked right over to it and then knocked on the door. At first, nobody answered. I figured that this guy would not answer the door, but I at least knew where he lived. I decided to knock again though, and surprisingly, this time the door opened up. But it was not the same guy. A woman was standing there. I did not know her, but I did recognize her and had seen her in the building before. She asked me what I wanted so late at night and seemed kind of annoyed. I asked her who the man was who had just entered the apartment, and she said it was her boyfriend. She said that he was staying with her for a couple of days. I told her that he stole my Chipotle several nights ago and was now messing with me. As I was saying this, I actually saw the guy walk by in the apartment behind her. He seemed to overhear and then walked over to us. The woman was starting to say that she had no idea what I was talking about and she was really confused, but the man interrupted the conversation and said that I was crazy and it never happened. I said that I had just seen him knock on my door and run away minutes earlier. The woman then seemed to question her boyfriend. I remember she said that he had just been gone for a minute and then asked him where he went. I don't remember what excuse he started to make up, but the woman didn't seem to believe him. She then said she remembered him having Chipotle the other night as well. The guy was still claiming that I was making it up and stuff, but the two of them were seeming to get into an argument. I was just standing there in the doorway now watching them. The woman soon asked if I could go and shut the door, but they continued to argue. I felt that I had probably solved the case, and I figured that the guy would not do something like that again, so I left and headed back to my apartment. I was really shocked at what I had just seen. So I got back to my place and I was going to start getting ready for bed. However, probably about 15 minutes or so later, there was a loud knocking at my door, and the knocking soon turned into a very loud banging. I went to the door and looked through the peephole. The man was back, and he was angrily banging on my front door. I yelled from the other side that I was calling the cops. The man did not stop, and kept literally punching at my door. I dialed 911 and reported the situation. It sounded like the man soon began to kick at my door then. This went on for a good 2 or 3 more minutes before stopping. The man finally then stormed off. About 10 minutes later, the police arrived. I told them what I knew, and they said they would go to the apartment that the guy was staying at. Well, I found out later that he had left. I guess he had in fact been staying for a few days with the woman he was dating, But after their argument, she kicked him out, and then he started banging at my door, I guess out of anger. After that, he left the place. I later heard that he had anger issues and a troubled past. The woman and him broke up though, so I haven't had to deal with him since. One weekend in the middle of the summer, my friends and I planned a weekend trip to go to a cabin. My friends and I had rented it for a break from our busy lives. The cabin was in a remote spot by a lake surrounded by trees. We didn't think much of it when we noticed the weather report predicting thunderstorms. Even if it did rain for most of the weekend, we could still have a great time hanging out inside the cabin. We arrived Friday evening and settled into the small but cozy cabin. We had planned to spend the weekend fishing, playing board games, and cooking meals together. The storm rolled in later that night. At first, it was just a light drizzle, but by midnight, the rain was coming down hard, and the wind was howling through the trees. We were playing cards in the living room as the storm ragged on outside. The power flickered a couple of times, but it stayed on. The storm grew stronger, and the lightning flashes became more frequent. Around 2 a.m., the power went out completely, and it was pitch black except for the occasional flash of lightning. We lit some candles and kept playing cards, trying to keep the mood light. There was no way to charge our phones, so we were cut off from the outside world. At some point, we heard a loud bang from outside. We all looked at each other, uneasy, wondering if a tree branch or something had fallen and hit the house. One of my friends, Mark, suggested that we check it out. We grabbed a flashlight and headed out onto the porch. The rain was coming down in sheets, and the wind was so strong it felt like it might blow us over. We shined the flashlight around, but couldn't see anything like a fallen limb from a tree, but we just assumed that it was something that had been caused by the storm. We went back inside and tried to forget about it and huddled around the fireplace talking. As we sat there, someone knocked on the door to the cabin. It was strange because we hadn't seen any cars on the road, and it was impossible for anyone else to be out in this weather. We all exchanged nervous glances. Mark, being the bravest of us all, went to the door and opened it a crack. There was nobody there, just the rain and the wind. We shrugged it off and assumed it was just our imaginations playing tricks on us. But then, a few minutes later, the knocking started again, louder this time. It was a repetitive, constant knock, like somebody was trying to get our attention. Mark, still determined to prove there was nothing to worry about, went to open the door again. This time, he stood outside for a moment, and when he came back inside from the porch, he was pale. "There's something out there," he said. "I saw a figure standing by the edge of the lake." None of us really believed him. The storm was so intense, it was hard to see anything clearly. The storm raged on, and with Mark's persuasion, who was still freaking out saying he saw something out by the lake, we decided to barricade the door just in case. We piled furniture in front of it and tried to get some sleep for the rest of the night. In the early hours of the morning, we heard a sound that none of us could explain. It was like a dragging noise, moving around the cabin. We huddled together in the living room, too scared to sleep now. The dragging sound seemed to be circling the cabin, slowly and deliberately. At first light, we ventured outside once the storm had passed. We looked around, but there was nothing unusual and we saw no footprints or sign of anybody else being there. We decided to pack up and leave. The atmosphere had become too unsettling, and Mark was still insisting that he saw something creepy out there last night. As we were loading the car, I noticed something strange. The knock marks on the door were much deeper than before, like somebody had tried to break in. We left the cabin and didn't return. To this day, none of us can explain the knocking, the dragging noise, or the figure by the lake. We try to put it behind us, but the memory of that stormy night still lingers.
This happened over 10 years ago when I was in high school. My friend Claire came to sleep over. We made plans to sneak out and hang out with some guys, but we had to convince them to pick us up because neither of us had a car and they lived too far away for us to walk there. The guy who rented the apartment agreed to do it and said he would drive us home at the end of the night. Once my parents were asleep, we went out to our friend's apartment and had some fun for a while. Around midnight, Claire decided it was time for us to head back. But when we asked to be taken home, everyone suddenly changed their mind about driving us. They all said they were either too drunk or too high, and the guy who drove us there said he wasn't going to help us because we didn't put out for him and his friends. Being drunk and pissed off at all of them, we left the apartment without much of a plan to get home. We decided to just start walking back, and we would make some phone calls to see if anyone could pick us up to bring us back the rest of the way. My house was a good 20 minutes away by car on the highway, so there was no way we were walking the whole way. The apartment was toward the back of the complex, so we started making our way to the entrance. We didn't even get halfway there before a car rolled up behind us and started slowly following us. I was 15 or 16 at the time and very naive, so I wasn't too concerned. But Claire was a little smarter than me. She told me to start walking faster. The car also picked up its pace to stay close to us. Claire told me to walk even faster. We started moving as fast as we could without running, and that's when the car sped up and passed us, then stopped a few feet in front of us. The passenger doors opened and 2 men jumped out. Realizing there's no way to walk out of this situation, Claire shouts at me to run. She took off and I followed close behind. We weaved through a couple of small side streets, then ran toward a group of parked cars and jumped behind a pickup truck. For a minute, we hoped and prayed that we weren't spotted. This is where the details get a little fuzzy. Neither of us was sober, and we were suddenly panicking out of our minds. I was about to lose it, but Claire just barely managed to keep a grip on the situation. One of the men had just gotten back in the car at some point, as only one person seemed to be following us on foot. A little after we started hiding, we heard a set of footsteps approaching the truck. Claire told me to keep quiet and stick close to her. Before we knew it, the man was right on the other side of the truck. He circled the truck looking for us, forcing us to slowly and quietly move to stay on the opposite side to avoid being spotted. It felt like a scene from a movie or a video game. We somehow managed to do 2 or 3 circles around the vehicle without being detected. If we hadn't hid behind a giant heavy-duty pickup truck, it would have been over for us. By the grace of the gods, he gave up after a minute and went back to the car with the others. That was our one shot to get away. Claire took my hand and ran off. We sprinted for what felt like an eternity, but in reality, it was probably only 15 to 20 seconds. We found the pool house area and a spot to hide in some bushes behind a fence. But there wasn't much we could do there except anxiously wait to see if they would discover us. Their car pulled around to the pool house not long after. We bit our nails, hoping they didn't stop to get out. The car slowly drove away, clearly still scanning for us. But at least in that moment, we realized we hadn't been spotted. We were safe, for now, but not nearly out of the woods. The car circled around the apartment complex for hours. They weren't giving up. We had to find a way out of there, and the men trying to kidnap us weren't our only problem. It was the middle of winter, and of course, we were dressed to impress the guys we went to hang out with, wearing short shorts and revealing tops. We were freezing. We looked around in the bushes and found a dirty, disgusting Captain America blanket that we huddled together under while making phone calls to find someone to pick us up. We tried contacting the guys at the apartment, but no one answered our calls. None of our friends answered our calls either. We felt completely alone and helpless. We were stuck there in constant danger and terrible conditions the entire night until finally, around 5 a.m., someone answered and said they would pick us up. It was the best news I had ever heard in my life. Our friend got to the apartment complex, but they didn't want to park in front of the pool house until the car that was looking for us was out of sight. They were worried it would give them away as the person helping us escape. Maybe they were right, but it was agonizing knowing our ticket out of there was aimlessly driving around the complex, just like our ticket to hell. At last, there was an opening. They parked in front of the pool house and we made a run for it. We spotted their car and hopped in as fast as we could, yelling at them to step on the gas. Our friends sped off toward the entrance. We passed the kidnappers on our way out, and that was the last we saw of them. We made it back to my house around 6 a.m., just in time to sneak back in without my parents ever knowing we even left. If Claire hadn't been with me that night, I definitely would have been abducted, or worse. I'm so thankful for her and our friend who picked us up. But as for the adult men who wanted to take advantage of us as teenagers and didn't care about our safety, and especially to the pieces of garbage who wanted to hurt us, they can all burn in hell. This happened in 1995 when I was 22 years old. I had just started living on my own in my first apartment. I worked as a waitress at a restaurant a few blocks away. That night, I got off work around 11 p.m. It wasn't unusual for me to walk home late. There were two ways I took to get to my apartment building. I could stick to the sidewalk, well lit with decent foot traffic, or I could cut through the communal garden, pitch black and set back from the street. I saved about a minute by going through the garden. Being young and stupid, of course, most of the time I took the shortcut. That night, though, I got a weird gut feeling not to take the shortcut. There was no one else around, and the entryway into the garden seemed darker than usual. So I walked right past it and kept to the sidewalk. When I passed the exit of the garden where I would have come out, suddenly a large man popped out from the garden behind me. I saw him appear over my shoulder, and a chill ran down my spine. He wasn't walking on the garden path when I passed the exit. I would have noticed him. The only logical explanation was that he had been hiding in the pitch black garden. He came out just to start following me. Was his original plan to grab me and pull me into the garden, or was he some drunk person who accidentally caught me by surprise? I began walking faster. My dad had taught me to always carry my keys in my fist with a key pointed out in case I needed to punch someone. So I had that, but I'm 5'4" and probably weighed 110 pounds back then. This guy was tall and big. My only chance was to outpace him. Even when I started speed walking, I felt him matching my pace and getting closer. He was breathing heavily, and he had this angry energy coming off of him. My apartment building was just up ahead, so I put on a burst of speed. When I got to the entrance, two people were leaving and holding the door for me and him. I don't know why I didn't call out to tell them I thought I was being followed. I was completely focused on getting inside my apartment. Plus, in the back of my mind, I was still trying to rationalize it. Maybe he was visiting someone in the building. Maybe it was all just a coincidence. I was just being paranoid. And in the end, it didn't matter. It took only a couple of seconds for them to leave. I had missed my chance to get help from them. I entered the building with the man following right behind me and started climbing the stairs as fast as I could. It was a 3-story building, and I lived on the 3rd floor. I raced up to the top, but the man was never more than 1 floor behind. I got to my floor, which had 4 apartments on both sides of the hallway. My door was the 3rd on the right. By the time I passed the first 2 doors of my neighbors, the man was already exiting the stairwell. When I got to my door, I froze. I realized that if I opened my door, he would catch up to me before I could get in and lock it. He would force me inside, and then I'd be trapped with him, doomed to suffer through whatever he wanted to do with me. I might not even live through it. As I considered this, he walked behind me, passing by just an inch away, close enough for me to smell him. He was disgusting. I wanted to run away and throw up and scream all at the same time. He stopped in front of the 4th apartment, where I knew he didn't live. He didn't say anything. He just stood there staring at me, breathing heavily. He also didn't knock on the door, making it even more clear that he wasn't visiting. He was waiting for me to open my door so he could attack me. I knew the momentary standoff wouldn't last long. Eventually, he would try to make something happen by force, so I racked my brain trying to think of a way out. Suddenly, I started banging on my door as loud as I could, and I yelled my neighbor's name, begging him to let me in. This action startled the man. He seemed even more confused when it wasn't my door that opened, but the door right in front of him. My neighbor Kevin saw the random guy standing right in front of his door and asked what he wanted. The guy started mumbling something about having the wrong apartment, and while he was distracted, I quickly slipped into my apartment and locked the door. I grabbed my cordless phone to call the police, but I heard Kevin in the hallway telling the man he needed to leave. I watched anxiously through the peephole until he finally walked away, making one last bone-chilling glance at me through the door. Kevin knocked on my door moments later and asked if I'm okay. I thanked him and said that I was fine, but on the inside, I was still terrified. The adrenaline was still pumping through my veins. I told Kevin to have a good night. Then I locked my door again. Alone, I had my phone in my hand ready to call the police, but I started trying to rationalize it again. What exactly had just happened? A guy followed me home, but then said he had the wrong apartment? Would the cops even care about something minor like that? I tried to calm myself down, but the more I thought of it, the more I berated myself. Why didn't I run the instant I felt him following me? Why didn't I tell the people in front of the building that I thought I was being chased? Worse, why didn't I tell that to Kevin the second he opened his door and saved me? I put him in danger by making him go face to face with a person who could have been capable of anything. Because of my panicking brain, everything felt so ambiguous. I felt like I made almost every wrong decision possible. I knew I was incredibly lucky to be okay, and I never forgot about it. A couple of weeks later, I visited my grandparents, and my grandfather read to me a story in the paper he was reading. He told me that a woman was attacked and violated in the apartment building across the street from mine. Then I saw the picture of the man who did it. It was the same guy that came after me that night. He had multiple convictions for sexual assault and had recently been released on parole. Had he been successful in following me into my apartment, the victim would have been me. I remember 2 weeks after Christmas. I was so thrilled to go shopping. I had received so many gift cards and couldn't wait to use them. The closest mall to me was in a bigger city about 30 minutes away. Being 17 years old, I would normally have someone to go with me to the mall. On a random Wednesday, I decided I couldn't wait any longer to go shopping. My boyfriend was busy working at the time, and all of my friends were still out of town. I decided that I would just have a day to myself and go shopping alone. Part of me was excited about this, so I wouldn't have anyone rushing me, but part of me was nervous. Once arriving at the mall, it was about 4 p.m. I decided I was going to stay until 6, but no later. After doing some shopping, I decided it was time to leave. I was happy with my purchases and couldn't wait to go home and glance at everything I had bought. I pulled out of the mall parking lot and went toward the Interstate. I'm a very self-aware person, so my entire time at the mall, I glanced around to make sure no one was staring at me or following me. Everything seemed fine until a few minutes after I merged onto the Interstate. At this point, it was now 6:30, and the sun had started to go down. A few moments later, it was pitch black outside. The Interstate was fairly empty as it was a Wednesday past peak rush hour. I remember being in the slow lane, just listening to music, going about 68 miles an hour. Suddenly, I noticed a car getting off at an exit behind me and slowly creeping up close to my car. I sped up as I assumed maybe it was just someone getting impatient. They sped up and got closer. I began to become irritated, so I got over into the next lane. This part of the Interstate had 4 lanes and was fairly empty, so there was no reason whatsoever that they couldn't just go around me. I turned on my blinker and accelerated. Just then, I glanced into my rearview mirror and noticed them follow me into the next lane. I felt my heart start racing. so I decided I would get over one more time, just in case. At this point, I was now in the third lane, closest to the fast lane. The car accelerated and got over behind me again. Now I was becoming extremely annoyed, so I jumped to 80 miles an hour and merged into the fast lane. The car followed behind me, matching my speed and acceleration. I began to get scared. Not enough cars were on the interstate to notice the car behind me. It was so dark outside, too. I decided I was going to transition all the way over to the slowest lane again. I moved over 4 lanes gradually, and the car followed my every move. At this point, I could confirm they were, in fact, following me. I glanced in my rearview mirror, but I couldn't see anything. All I could make out was a dark-colored sedan with extremely tinted windows. I couldn't tell the color of the car because of how dark it was outside. The car couldn't even stay straight, and they were swerving like crazy. They were so close to me that I couldn't see the entire car in my mirrors. I was in shock, still processing what was happening. I was unsure what to do. My exit was coming up in about a mile. The only thing I could think of was to call my mom. I called my mom and explained the situation. She became very serious and stern. For some reason, I was so fixated on the situation that it didn't even cross my mind to call the police. I asked my mom on the phone what I should do. She told me to come straight home. I heard her and my stepdad bickering in the background. He suggested I stop at the local Kroger in my town and run in and ask for help. I didn't want to cause a scene and risk them grabbing me when I parked. I told him I wasn't comfortable doing that. My mom told me to come home instead of heading the direction of the police station. I wasn't quite sure exactly where it was, but I knew it was more rural, and I was nervous about the car trying to cut me off or trap me on a back road. I decided to listen to my mom and come home. The car followed me off my exit and stayed behind me at the light toward my town. I turned left at the light with an arrow. The car behind me ran the light and sped up behind me. I noticed them swerving again. I was freaking out while on the phone with my mom, but I was trying to calm myself down. Maybe they were going to turn a different way soon. They followed me at the very next light when I turned left again. I had one more light and then the entrance to my neighborhood. Just then, I heard my mom say on the phone, "Get the gun." Being from the South, I grew up around guns, but we were never put in a situation where they would need to be used. My heart started to rapidly beat as I looked behind me and saw the same car still following me closely. I was so nervous, unsure of what was fixin' to happen. Were they just trying to scare me? My mom kept asking me on the phone if I did anything to them. Did you cut them off? No, I answered to every scenario she asked. All I did was mind my own business. One more light, and soon after was the turn into my neighborhood. They followed me as I turned left again at the last light. My mom assured me that she and my stepdad were ready to take care of things. My neighborhood entrance was now approaching, and I didn't turn my blinker on, but still turned. They followed. I lived in a cul-de-sac with 4 other houses. I turned into my cul-de-sac, and the car followed. I pulled into my driveway to see my mom holding a pistol up in the air and my stepdad standing next to her. She screamed out, "You better go on!" and the car circled out of the neighborhood. Once the car circled out, I ran up the stairs and hugged my mom. I went inside and was planning on calling 911. Just then, the car circled into the cul-de-sac again, this time going extremely slowly past my house. My mom pointed the gun towards their car, and they sped up and drove off. I was the most scared I had ever been in my entire life. I was shaking. I wish I could have gotten their license plate, but without being able to see the color of the car or get a proper plate picture, there was no point in reporting it. I was just glad that I was home. I stayed up really late that night, wondering what could have happened. Did they follow me from the mall? Did they just randomly decide to follow me? Did I get in their way on the interstate? So many things crossed my brain, but all I could wonder was what they wanted with me. As a young female, my mind thought possibly I was followed due to trafficking. I still don't know to this day what that car wanted from me, but I'm just glad I got home safe. Sometimes I wonder if they remember my address, or if they're ever going to try to show up again. I lock my doors every single night now, and never go to the mall alone.
When I was about 11 years old, my living situation was very unstable. My parents divorced when I was a toddler because my mom got addicted to drugs. And although my dad fought for full custody, the court decided I should stay with her on the weekends. Since I was too young to truly understand the darker parts of my mom's lifestyle, I reveled in the increased freedom and lack of supervision with her. I was home alone a lot. She was always going out doing God knows what, and hung out with some really shady people, doing errands with them. The worst part about living there were the adults. My mom would have groups of people over to do drugs together, often ending in strangers crashing on the couch for days at a time, or in my bed if I wasn't home. The creepiest person in the apartment complex was this weird guy who lived 5 apartments down. He was about 50 years old and looked really unkempt. He would call me a little cutie every time I had to walk past his apartment, and I saw him walking down the hallway in his underwear several times. I didn't have to deal with him much until my mom started to bring him over. I'm pretty sure he was supplying a lot of the drugs that were being done. Every time he came over, he stared at me with this blank yet sinister stare. It always made me uncomfortable. One night, I was alone in the apartment, watching shows on Adult Swim. It was about 1 in the morning. My mom walked in, saying that she only had one more errand for the night and that she'd be back in about 5 minutes. Just before leaving, she mentioned that the lock had been a hassle lately and asked me to keep the door unlocked. I said okay, and then she left. Only 30 seconds later, there was a knock on the door. I assumed it was my mom because she was very forgetful. I opened the door without thinking. But as soon as I saw who was at the door, my heart stopped. It wasn't my mom. Standing in front of me was the old creep from 5 apartments down. He had a wide, excited grin on his face. I slammed the door and locked it without hesitation. I started to freak out. I was already scared of this man. No way was I going to talk to him at 1 a.m. when I was by myself, especially considering I didn't even have a phone. The man knocked and said through the door that he and my mom made an agreement for him to come watch over me while she was gone. I told him I didn't know about it. He kept trying to convince me to open the door. But one of the few things I knew at that age was not to let strangers in when I was home alone. Suddenly, he went psychotic and started pounding on the door. He was screaming and cursing at the top of his lungs, repeatedly telling me that we had some kind of deal. But I had no idea what he was talking about. I ran to the kitchen and grabbed a knife, then sat on the other side of the door. There was a large window directly next to the front door. It would be very easy to break it and then unlock the door, so I was ready to stab his hand if he tried to do so. The banging on the door went on for about 20 minutes before it went silent. But it wasn't a silence I trusted. Even if it seemed like he had left, I knew in my gut he just wanted me to think that. That's when I saw one of his eyes through a crooked blind on the window. He was looking directly at me. I jumped back just before he started pounding at the window. I was scared that at any second he was going to break in. Right before it was too late, I heard another man yelling down the hall. He swore at the creep and threatened him. Apparently, the commotion woke up one of the neighbors. Thanks to them, the creep ran off. The neighbor knocked to see if everything was okay, but I was too scared to answer. I let him think nobody was home. After he left, I sat up wide awake in the living room, waiting. My mom came home a few hours later. I thought she would be mad that I locked the door, but when I opened it for her, she was definitely furious, but it wasn't for the reason I expected. She charged inside and looked at me with an angry glare, asking me why I didn't let him in. I asked who she was talking about, Then she said the name of our neighbor, the creep from 5 doors down. I was too confused to speak as my mom chewed me out. She said she told the man he could come over, but that I had screwed it all up, and now because of me, her window was broken. She dragged me outside and made me look at the front window, which now had a huge crack in it. At that moment, I realized he was only a few seconds from breaking in. I felt so weirded out by everything that I grabbed my overnight bag and walked back to my dad's house. He was surprised to see me. I didn't tell him what happened. It was too much for me to explain at the time. I only told him that I didn't want to go over there for a while. Either way, my dad was furious at my mom for letting an 11-year-old walk through the city at 4 in the morning. A few months later, I finally felt comfortable enough to go back, but when I got there, 5 cop cars were outside the building. I ignored them and went upstairs, only to see the cops outside of the old creep's apartment, dragging him out in handcuffs. I asked one of the adults who was spectating what he had done, and they said something I'll never forget. He had molested 3 other young boys in the building. Even worse, the adult looked down at me and said I was lucky he hadn't gotten to me, because I was exactly his type. Blonde hair and blue eyes. I ran home in disbelief, but when I turned on the TV, the news had his face plastered on the screen, confirming everything. I can never fully describe the surreal terror I felt at 11 years old, realizing that my own mother would endanger me by using me as a tool to get drugs. Even now, 14 years later, the visceral, overwhelming emotions and a complete shift in the way I saw my parents in the world will always be unforgettable. Back in 2022, I was 23 years old and living in London. I had recently moved into a small flat with my girlfriend and didn't have much money, so I worked 2 jobs. One as a cleaner and another as a food delivery cyclist for a company called Just Eat. The company had a hub where they stored their electric bikes, which employees would pick up and drop off at the start or end of the shift. I would go to different restaurants to pick up food and drop it off at different locations around London. On one particular day, early in the morning, it was freezing cold outside, but I still had to go to work for Just Eat. It was common for delivery cyclists to wear balaclavas to keep warm, and I was wearing a balaclava on this day. I had just dropped someone's food off at a council estate block. As I was getting ready to go back onto my bike, I could hear a man shouting very loudly. I looked over to my left across the street and saw a man screaming while walking behind a lady who was pushing a baby pram. He was tall and wearing a hoodie with a mask on his face. I stopped for a minute because I felt concerned for the lady. The man appeared to be shouting at the mother viciously, and she was obviously uncomfortable. After I watched for a few seconds, the woman turned left and went down a different road to avoid the man. I thought he was going to follow her, but he didn't. He carried on shouting, but now he was crossing the street and walking towards me. I got a bit worried, but thought maybe he was just one of those crazy guys in big cities that walk around shouting. Admittedly, I was a bit frozen, like a deer in headlights. As he kept approaching, I could hear better what he was saying, and it wasn't good. He was screaming with a lot of anger, asking me why I was there and that he had told me if he saw me again, he would chef me up, which I knew meant he was going to stab me. This was confirmed by the knife he then revealed from his coat. What didn't make sense was that I had never seen this guy before in my life. But then I realized that my face was concealed by the balaclava, so he could easily have mistaken me for his worst enemy or something. I decided not to take a chance on revealing my face to show him I wasn't who he thought I was, since he seemed too mentally unstable for logic or reason. I started to quickly unlock my bike as he was getting closer to me, still screaming at the top of his voice. I was so scared my mind wasn't working properly. I was struggling to unlock the bike, but finally I did after an infuriating length of time. I got on my bike and cycled away. When I looked over my shoulder, I could see he was running towards me at full speed with the knife in his hand. I panicked and feared for my life, cycling faster and faster. I was next to a public park, so I cycled into it. I looked back again and he was still running with the knife. But I could see that I was far enough distance from him to stop and have time to potentially defuse the situation. I quickly stopped and shouted to him that I didn't know who he was and that he had the wrong guy. It didn't seem to have any effect at all. Quite the opposite, in fact. After I stopped, he began to run even faster and close the distance between us, continuing to shout. I couldn't understand what he was saying at this point because of the adrenaline and pure fear in my body. I gave up on trying to reason with him and sped off without looking back. Whilst I was cycling, I shouted that I was sorry and pleaded with him to stop chasing me. I kept trying to get through to him that I didn't know him, but he was completely hell-bent on attacking me with that knife. It was clear by the look in his eyes. The only thing he was feeling was rage, and the only thing he was thinking about was murder. I realized it was stupid to stop before. He could have easily surprised me with his speed and caught up with me. Had that happened, he surely would have stabbed me, and he didn't look like the type of man to let his victims bleed out. Yet, I managed to get away and kept going until he was nowhere in sight. I went back to the company hub and told my supervisor what happened. They said they would call the police, but I never heard back from my work about what the police said. And I wouldn't be surprised if the police said they never caught him. It's probably because this is London, a city known for being a place where these kind of things happen quite often. I'm sure my case is far from unique. And since there were no casualties, I can't imagine it was at the top of their priority list. After the incident, I was very shaken up. So I ended my shift there and went home. My supervisor was thankfully understanding. Since then, if I hear a loud noise in public or somebody shouting, I get scared. My heart starts racing and I sweat profusely, no matter the temperature. I tend to look behind me more when I'm walking home late at night. And I can never put on another balaclava for the rest of my life. No matter how cold it gets, it won't be worth the risk to me. I'm just glad that he didn't catch up with me. Because if he did, I don't know what he would have done. It looked like he wanted to kill me. There are many nights I can't sleep. I close my eyes and see him staring back at me, forcing my mind to wander to all the potential agonizing fates I might have met had I let him get a hold of me.
This incident happened some years ago when I was still a student. Summer vacations were something me and my two younger brothers always looked forward to. So that year, we went to our grandparents' house taking some time off from the chaotic city life. We spent our days playing and feasting on treats our grandparents showered us with. One evening, my grandparents and my entire family took a trip to a nature park, whereas I stayed back home catching a cold from eating too many ice cones. My mom told me to rest and warm the soup for dinner that she left in the fridge. I was watching TV lying on the living room couch when lightning cracked in the distance. I looked out and noticed dark clouds spreading over the sky slowly. It started to drizzle and wind howled in agony. It was dark as night outside. The trees that were towered over the house moved like crazy. The power suddenly went out as I swam around the darkness trying to find the torch. My dad called. He said he'd be late as a huge tree fell on the road, blocking their way home. So they were staying over for the time being at a friend's until help arrived and cleared the road. I was never a big fan of the darkness, and suddenly I was alone and waiting in the dark. The house was pretty big, with 2 stories and a large area of land outside. I couldn't find a flashlight, so I went to the kitchen and found some candles. I was lighting one up when I heard footsteps in our front garden. I tiptoed to a big window and peeked outside. The rain was pouring heavily by then, so it took some time for my eyes to adjust the vision. A flashlight was moving outside our house. I could see a silhouette of a man every time the lightning struck. He seemed to know the place well and darted straight to the kitchen door at the back of the house. Who the hell is this guy? Is he a thief? My heart started pounding on my chest. For the next 5 seconds, I heard nothing but the storm, but then a deep voice called out my grandma's name. "Oh, Janie, are you alone?" What the frack? His voice gave me goosebumps. Our doors had huge grills and bar locks, so it was quite impossible to come in, but I was certainly creeped out. He called out again, "Jenny, where are you?" I remained silent. By this time, I'd recognized his voice. He was my grandparents' neighbor next door. I saw him staring at our house the first day I came here. He sang religious songs with a mic quite early in the morning, irking everyone, and sometimes just stood outside with a blank expression while we were outside playing. He always eyed my grandmother and on certain occasions even barged into our garden to make small talk with her. The guy had gray hair with a wide smile. He would just stare at Grandma even when our family members were around. Dad said he lost his wife a few days ago. The realization that he had decided to go after my grandma made me nauseous. He started going in each of the windows, calling out my grandma's name. He couldn't see inside, and I stayed still. My grandma usually drove a small car, and seeing that car parked on the driveway, he must have assumed she was alone at home while everyone else left. Time went by, and he grew tired. After a torturous 15 minutes that felt like an eternity, I heard the footsteps walk away and jump down one of the walls. I sighed in relief, knowing he finally gave up. An hour later, my family came back, and I welcomed them with this horrifying tale. My parents decided to confront the guy in the morning, but they had no idea what was about to happen that night. That night, I slept on the small sofa near my grandparents' bed. I was burning with a high fever. Instead of sleep, I was in a trance-like state. I tossed around with body aches, trying to find a comfortable position when I heard shuffling of feet somewhere. I heard a soft clinking noise like someone was tapping on the glass window. My eyes slowly drifted to the direction of that voice, and I saw him again. The old creep was back. He had glued his grinning face on the window, which was just a few inches away from my grandparents' bed. I tried to scream, but I was so sick and scared that no sound came out of my mouth. So far, he was staring at my grandparents' bed, but just when he noticed me, his expression changed. His eyes widened, jaw tightened in anger, and he put his finger on his mouth while angrily mouthing me to be quiet or else he would kill me. I don't know how long we had this staring showdown, but suddenly he turned his anger into a sudden smile. He tilted his head to the left and continued watching my grandma through that window. I wanted to slap myself so I could wake my body up from this numbness, but fear and shock kept me frozen for quite some time. But finally, I gathered the courage and knocked down the small bookshelf beside my bed. The sound woke up my grandma, and she found me gasping and panting while pointing at the window. She switched on the lights to find the creep laughing shamelessly and telling my grandma how beautiful she looked when she slept from the window. "Oh, Jenny, my beautiful Jenny." He kept repeating this phrase again and again. He said that now that his wife was dead, he was finally ready for my grandma. My dad called the cops, and they took him away. The guy died a few months later, but to this day, a doubt clusters my mind. Did the passing of that old creep's healthy, cheerful wife have some mystery in it? There's one childhood memory I'll never forget. As I grow older, I still see it weaved in my imagination. It's like a nightmare that I can't seem to shake off. My dad, newly promoted in the bottling company he worked at, decided to relocate from Sango to a more upbeat town in Lagos. We shifted to this old yet majestic duplex with 5 big rooms, 3 toilets, and no nearby houses. One day, I came back from school earlier than usual. My mom had taken leave from work to decorate our living room and kitchen. Seeing her car parked outside, I ran inside the house. I started yelling, "Mom, I'm home," but no reply came in turn. "Mom?" I called again. Still no answer. I was heading towards the kitchen thinking she'll be there when she answered from upstairs. "Yes?" she said. I immediately felt goosebumps hearing her voice. I still wonder why. What caused that little shiver of dread that ran down my spine at that moment? I walked upstairs uneasily. The big empty room stood silent in the corridor. We were still unpacking and decorating, so the house was a mess. I called out to her again when I reached the landing, wanting to know the exact room she was in. "Mom, where are you?" "In here." The reply was weird. Her voice sounded too casual and full of mischief. It felt strange because my mom was usually soft-spoken and quiet in nature. I figured out the voice came from the last room at the end of the hallway. I stopped at the closed door, wondering what she was doing that made her sound that way. My hands were on the doorknob, ready to open, when the kitchen door slammed shut downstairs, and I heard my mother's voice ring out. "Ami, where are you? How many times will I tell you to stop leaving your bag on the kitchen table?" And that was my mom, no doubt. A pang of shiver ran down my spine as I stood outside the closed door, and then I heard whispers from the other side of the door. "Go on, Ami. Your mom's calling you." I literally felt my heart shrink as I jumped away from the door in absolute shock. "Mom!" I screamed in terror as I ran down the stairs, trying to contain my erratic heart. In one final attempt to get rid of my fears, I looked back, and I wish I hadn't. The door had opened a crack, and for a moment I saw something behind that door. A wide, bloodshot eye, staring right at me. I told my mother, and she went back to check the room. To our surprise, it was locked from the inside. The keys didn't help, so we had to wait till my father returned home. He tried to open the door with basic tools, but nothing helped. I told him someone was inside the room, but he obviously didn't believe me. My mom got a little creeped out by then, so she asked him to break down the door. But my dad didn't want to damage the house, so he informed the locksmith to come the next morning. Now, my room was the closest one to that room, and the lock in my room was broken. When I went to sleep after dinner, I kept fearing that whatever was in that room would end up sneaking into my bedroom in the middle of the night. So to be on the safe side, I pushed my cardboard box full of toys as a support behind my door and went to sleep. I don't remember what time it was. I woke up hearing a clattering sound in my room. As I opened my eyes, I found the door flung open and the cardboard box pushed away. A weird-looking figure was sitting next to my box and playing with my toys while whispering some inaudible crap. I gasped seeing this, and the figure turned its head towards me. It was a man with a pale, bloated face like something happened to his skin. His eyes were scary, and he just stared at me. Then suddenly, he stood up, raised his arms towards the ceiling, and started laughing out loud. I screamed with all my breath, and my parents rushed in. I heard my dad yell from the corridor, "What the? Who are you?" And the man ran straight to my open window and landed on the grass. And then we heard running footsteps fade away. My dad called the cops, and they found old rags, leftover food, and water bottles in that room. It seemed like that creepy guy was living here until we came. My parents apologized to me for not believing me earlier. We renovated the entire house and installed a security camera for our safety. After that day, we never saw the man again.
I was getting out of work late due to a recent security issue at our company that had everyone working overtime. I would usually take the train to and from work, but since I knew I'd be out past the train's running hours, I had to drive. It was nearly an hour to get home. As I was getting out of the city though, I saw that my gas was almost empty. I didn't remember it being this low before work, but I could have been too tired to have even noticed it. I knew there was a gas station by my house though, so I was just gonna fill it up there. But 10 minutes later, an alert came up on my dashboard that I was extremely low on fuel. It had gone down way more than it should have in such a short time, and within a minute, my car was stuttering and barely running. I pulled over, and just as I put it in park, the engine cut out. I tried to start it again, but it didn't budge. I was both worried and frustrated, like how the hell was this even happening? I took out my flashlight from the glove compartment and got out. The issue took less than 5 seconds to find. There was gas clearly leaking. I had no idea how this could even have happened, since everything was fine earlier. But before I could do much thinking, a truck pulled up behind me. Their headlights were off, and they parked unnervingly quickly, like there was no hesitation. I stood up and looked at their windshield, seeing a couple figures moving around in there. "I'm okay, guys. Don't need any help," I called out, but they didn't pay any attention. They kept moving around, until one of the doors opened, or others stayed in the truck. The way he said it was weird though, with a strange tone to his voice. Again, I said I didn't need anything. He kept walking though, until he was right in front of me, standing uncomfortably close. "Why don't I give you a ride home? It's the least I could do," he said, giving a creepy, forced smile. I declined his offer and quickly got into my car. Disturbingly, he stood there for a while, like an entire minute, just looking at me through the window and not saying anything. I just looked forward and called the police for help with my car. But the whole time, I could see him in the corner of my eye, standing right outside my window and just staring at me. During the phone call though, he walked back to his truck. I watched in the mirror as he got in, then slowly drove past me. We made eye contact as he passed by, and for a brief moment, I saw someone in his back seat. They were pressed up against the window, with wide open eyes, and although I couldn't get a good look at them, I knew something was wrong. I don't think that person was inside that truck willingly. When he drove off though, the license plate was missing. Police showed up and I told them everything. There was a bit of an investigation where they found my gas tank was stabbed purposefully by someone. Likely what happened was the guy planned the whole thing out, following me until my car broke down and hoping to get me to accept the ride. Whether that person was truly in danger, we don't know, because the man was never found. I was 17 and living in my parents' basement. It wasn't a trashy basement or anything. It was probably similar to what would be considered an in-law suite. My parents traveled for work all the time, so I usually wouldn't be in the basement unless I was sleeping in the bedroom down there, or playing video games, or whatever. This was during one of my parents' work trips. I was alone for a whole week. This night was a Saturday, so I didn't have school, or really anything to do. I knew it was supposed to storm later in the day though, so before it was too late, I took my parents' car out to the store and got some food to make. While driving back, the storm rolled in. The roads weren't busy, thankfully, because even with the windshield wipers going at the fastest setting, it was still difficult to see. I pulled into the driveway and ran to the front door, getting inside and drying off. I then went straight to the kitchen and turned on the oven so I could make dinner. But almost right away, I heard something below me. It sounded like something falling over in the basement, like maybe a box or something. My first thought was that there might be a leak down there, and I got really worried about a possible flood, so I quickly went to the basement. I opened the door and flicked on the light, and as I walked down the steps, I didn't hear anything. No running water or any other sounds, and when I got to the bottom, everything looked okay. I walked through the main area, where I had a small couch and TV set up, and then I went to the storage room. This was the only unfinished part of the basement, where we just stored a bunch of boxes and stuff. I opened the door and looked in. At first, it all looked normal, and I was actually really confused at what I could have heard. All the boxes were stacked up still, and nothing was on the ground. But after a quick walkthrough, I noticed something really strange. One of the boxes sitting on top of the stack was open, and when I looked inside, everything was scattered all over the place. It was full of old trophies that my parents kept, and almost all of them were broken. It looked like the box had fallen and broken everything inside, and then someone quickly tossed everything back in. I felt a surge run through my body as I just stared at that box and realized what this meant. I looked up and started scanning the room. It felt like suddenly all I could think about was how loud the storm was outside, making me unable to listen for anything, which only got me more panicked. I started to back up, and just as I did, one of the boxes in the back of the room was knocked onto the ground, and behind it, a guy came running right at me. I booked it for the stairs, and I have to say, there is nothing more terrifying than hearing his footsteps climbing the stairs just a few feet behind me. The fear really got to me, and on the last step, I slammed my foot on the stairs and fell straight on the ground. Every horrible scenario just rushed through my head in that moment, but when I turned around, the guy came up to the top of the staircase and immediately ran for the front door, running out of the house. I got up and locked it behind him, then called the cops. They found an unlocked window that he climbed in through, but as far as why he came into the home, there really isn't any answer. I was working my regular 2 to 10 closing shift at a small drive-through cafe. It's a really small place, with just 5 or so indoor seating tables, since most of our business is focused on the drive-through. This wasn't a busy spot though, especially during the later hours of the day. Being the only one working the closing shift, I'd usually sit at one of the dining tables and be on my phone, only getting up if someone came to the drive-through. It was drizzling outside this night, so it was even less busy than it already would have been. Past 7 o'clock, not a single customer came through for 2 hours straight. I was just sitting at a table watching Netflix on my phone when suddenly the front door opened. It kind of startled me, as nobody ever comes inside the shop this late. He seemed to not notice me sitting at the table though, because he walked up to a different table on the other end of the store and sat down with his back facing me. Something was definitely off about this guy though. He was very tall and wearing really dark clothing, and although it was only drizzling outside, he was soaked. Water was dripping from all over his clothes and onto the floor, and that got me thinking about how he even got here. No cars had pulled in, so he must have walked. Anyway, I stood up and walked over to the table, greeting him and asking what he wanted. He didn't smile or say hi back to me. He just sat there with a blank look on his face. I waited a few seconds before repeating myself, but he cut me off. He asked who else was working tonight. I was confused, but also slightly nervous about that question, but I still answered for some reason. "It's just me, but we close in an hour." He then asked for a small coffee, so I walked back to the kitchen and started making it. I grabbed a cup and poured it in, then turned to go back to the table when I saw him standing in the doorway to the kitchen. "Do you need something else?" He didn't respond. Now facing directly at me, I could see that his eyes were bloodshot, but his face was still blank, like no emotion whatsoever. It made me really uneasy. "Put the drink down and come with me." He was demanding it, and he looked ready to force me if I didn't. This guy was way bigger than me, so I really had no choice. I moved slow, trying to think of any way out of this as I followed him. As we left the store though, he grabbed the back collar of my shirt and pushed me across the parking lot toward the road. On the other side of this empty road was a completely wooded area with no buildings or houses as far as I knew. and that's exactly where he was leading me. Just as we were about to cross the road though, a single car came out and rolled past us. As it did, the man stopped, which forced me to stop, and both of us stared at the car and realized what it was. A police officer looking right back at us. I started screaming, and the guy immediately let go and sprinted across the road and into the woods. The officer pulled right into the parking lot and made sure I was okay, then called for backup. What's crazy is he wasn't even on his shift. He was actually heading home for the night and just happened to see us at the perfect time to save me. If he had even been 30 seconds earlier or later, I would have been dragged into those woods, unseen, and probably never made it out. Anyway, the cameras picked up some decent footage of him, but as of yet, still nothing has been found. I'll update if anything else happens, but I just hope he doesn't come back. This was last year, I think sometime in April. It was raining pretty much every day here, but this night was a lot heavier than usual, with scattered thunderstorms throughout the day. I was at work for most of the afternoon, but got back home around 8. As I was driving down my neighborhood road though, it was very clear that something had happened. All the lights were out in every single home. I pulled into my driveway and parked, and of course when I entered and tried to turn on the lights, it didn't work. The power was completely out, and my whole house was basically pitch black. I tossed my stuff by the doorway, then went down to the electrical box just to see if for some reason that worked, but it didn't. This really sucked because I didn't have hardly any spare lights aside from my phone. What I ended up doing was getting my laptop and setting it up on the coffee table in my living room. The white screen from the YouTube page that I had open lit up most of the room, so I sat back and just watched some videos. I had to work early the next day, but I didn't feel comfortable going to bed with the power out, so I was already planning on staying up late. I probably sat there for a good 2 hours, watching YouTube and checking my phone for any updates on the weather. The lightning was shaking the whole house, so it was pretty bad out there. But randomly in the night, a thump came from outside the window. I jumped a little, then turned my laptop screen to light up that side of the room. I got up and walked over, then twisted open the blinds. I froze up for a second, not expecting to see a man standing right on the other side of the window. His drenched hair was falling over his face, and he was peering through the window at me. He yelled something, but I honestly couldn't hear him with the heavy rain and thunder in the background. Being so caught off guard though, I didn't know what to do. I was a little freaked out though, so I just closed the blinds. I felt kind of horrible about it, but why was he outside banging on my window anyway? I heard him hit the window a few more times, then it went quiet. I figured he'd either given up or moved on to another house, so I turned my laptop toward me again and continued watching YouTube. The storm stayed strong through the whole night. I must have been up for another hour, but my eyes got really heavy and I just couldn't hold out any longer. I lay down on the couch and drifted off to sleep. I woke up to a loud crash. I didn't know if it was a nearby lightning strike or what, but I immediately got up from the couch. The power was still out and the whole house was still pitch black. I turned my phone on and looked around, and that's when I heard something from the back of the house. My heart was pounding as I walked into the other room. When I shined my light down the house toward the back room, there were several large shards of glass on the ground reflecting the light back at me. I could then see the nearest window completely shattered, with rain pouring into the house and the blinds blowing frantically in the wind. And just a couple feet from there, I could see a shoulder sticking out from behind the wall. My whole body jerked when I saw them, and I instantly spun around and went for the front door. I ran through the rain, getting soaked all the way through, until I got to my neighbor's house. I stood under their overhang on the porch and called 911. It's no surprise that the man wasn't there when police showed up. Although not getting a full look at him inside my house, I was 100% sure it was the same guy from earlier, so I gave them that description. Oddly enough, or maybe not so much, there were 2 more reported break-in attempts that night, as well as several other reports of strange behavior outside people's homes. I was the only one unfortunate enough to have had them successfully break inside, but nobody knows what he was trying to do, and it seems like we won't ever know. Since then, he's never been sighted in or around our neighborhood.
I've spent the past few months holed up in the house with all the doors locked. It's because anytime I go out, I end up passing a Wendy's, and I get anxious whenever I see one of those restaurants. It takes me back to the most horrifying night of my life. It all started on a normal lunch rush at Wendy's. I was working the register, taking orders from dozens of rude customers. They all blended together after a while, but there was one woman who stood out. She was an old lady with wrinkled, sagging skin. Her hair was bright red and tied into 2 pigtails, just like the Wendy's mascot. She even wore the striped blue dress that Wendy wore. I thought it was weird that she was dressed like this, especially since she was old, but I tried to avoid judging customers. What can I get you?
You're perfect. You're exactly what I need.
I'm sorry?
The Colonel. You're the Colonel.
Excuse me?
Colonel Sanders. You look just like him.
Oh, the KFC mascot. I chuckled awkwardly. I was an older guy with white hair and a matching mustache, but I thought that was where the resemblance ended. Thanks. What can I get started for you? Without responding, the fake Wendy turned and ran out the door. She had a surprising pep in her step for an old lady. The whole interaction was weird, but I put it in the back of my mind since we were so busy. A few hours later, she stormed back into the restaurant, only this time she had a white suit with her. It was a replica of Colonel Sanders' outfit. She stormed up to my register with bulging eyes.
Here, put it on. It's perfect.
She shoved the suit over the counter, forcing it against my chest so hard I stumbled backward. Whoa, calm down, ma'am.
Put it on now! It's perfect!
Her shriek pierced the quiet restaurant. Customers turned around to look at us. Ma'am, please back up.
Put it on now!
My manager stormed out of his office. What's going on here? I wheeled around and told him that this creepy old lady was harassing me. I had a lot of problems with my manager, but one good thing about him was that he didn't take nonsense from customers. He immediately yelled at the creep to get out of the restaurant.
Not without the Colonel!
It freaked me out how she ignored my name tag and referred to me as the Colonel. My manager called the cops, and they came and escorted the lady out of the store. She didn't go easy. They had to drag her out of the store kicking and screaming. She kept looking at me and yelling Colonel over and over. Finally, the police wrangled her out of the restaurant. I thought that'd be the last time I'd ever see her. God, was I wrong. My next shift, 2 days later, was the 3rd shift. I normally didn't work that late, but my manager asked me to work with him that night as a favor. And since he'd gotten rid of that creepy lady for me, I figured I owed him one. The restaurant had a sinister vibe as I drove up to it. A thin fog had coasted in, and the bright neon lights from the sign barely chased off the darkness. Only one other car was in the parking lot, my boss's. I felt my hands get slick with sweat. I hated being out at night. I wanted to go back home, but I'd made a promise. I sighed and slipped out of my car. The Wendy's was dark as I walked in. The overhead lights were turned off. The only light came from the glowing menu screens behind the counter. I called out my manager's name but got no response. I knew he had to be there. I could hear the stove hissing and the fryers bubbling. Maybe he was just trying to conserve power. I swallowed my fear and stepped behind the counter, pushing the kitchen door open. I'll never forget what I saw. My manager was tied to a chair. Duct tape covered his mouth. His face was painted white, with red around the eyes and mouth. A red wig was shoved on his head, and he'd been crammed in a yellow jumpsuit. He looked like Ronald McDonald, but his eyes bugged out of his head in panic. The old lady stepped forward from the dark. She was still in her Wendy's costume. Her bony hand was wrapped tightly around a long kitchen knife.
Colonel Sanders, you're here.
My heart was hammering in my chest. I wanted to bolt, but I'd seen the old lady run, and she was just as fast as me. What do you want?
I need you, Colonel. You're one of the only ones I'm missing.
She took slow steps forward, getting closer and closer to me. I had no idea what this lady was talking about, but I didn't want to end up tied to a chair dressed as Colonel Sanders. I turned on my heels and ran. Before I could get to the door, that psycho threw the knife at me. It grazed my arm, slashing into my skin and sending hot pain searing through my body. I screamed, freezing in place and clutching my wound. Warm blood wet my fingers. I wheeled around. That crazy lady was shuffling towards me with that stupid white suit.
If I get you, I'm one step closer to a complete collection.
Get away from me, lady! I'm warning you! She wouldn't listen. She just kept inching towards me with that horrible grin. I was always told to never lay hands on a woman, but I knew this lady was going to hurt me if I didn't do something. I reared back my arm and punched her as hard as I could. My fist connected with her wrinkly skin, sending her flying backward. She let out a feeble yelp and smashed against the floor. Her head smacked against the black and white tile. Her eyes stared up at the ceiling blankly. A pool of blood began to form around her head, soaking her pigtails. I couldn't believe what I'd just done. I wanted to scream and run away, but I forced myself to untie my manager and call the cops. They came over and reviewed the security footage and determined that I'd been acting in self-defense. I didn't think it could get any more horrifying, but when the police searched her house, they found more bodies, and all of them had been dressed up as fast food mascots. The old lady had been going around and killing people to assemble a sick collection of corpses dressed as restaurant characters. I know she's dead now, but I've shaved my mustache and dyed my hair black just in case. Every night I have nightmares where she comes back to life and finds me again. Only those times, I don't escape her.